Okay, so like we said here, we have Shifu Jonathan Bluestein, and let me just say thank you for taking the time to contact us all the way over from Israel.
Hey, pleasure.
Why don't we start off like we normally do, and have you just kind of give some of your background on martial arts and the how and the why you got started in the first place?
Yeah, sure thing. So I've been fond of the martial arts from a young age. I believe that a lot of people have in their heart what they want to do in life, but oftentimes it's lurking in the background. It's deep in your subconscious, and it's not readily expressed, and you only find out about it when you reach your late teens or 20s or something like that. I was fortunate enough for it to come forth at an earlier age. I can remember myself maybe 6 or 7 years old, already asking my mom to study karate or judo because that's what was around these days. It was popular, and she's like a typical Jewish mother. You know, I'm not getting my son. I don't want my son to be violent. No, it's a terrible thing. All right, so I didn't get to study these things, maybe for better or worse. And when I was a teen already, I was thinking, well, like I can make some decisions for myself now, and just pulled myself into a boxing class one day, influenced by an anime show which I liked, Hajime no Ippo, which is a really good anime show if someone's into it in the crowd. In any case, and this show portrays in a very realistic manner, perhaps not the fighting as much, but a lot of the lifestyle and requirements that are of a professional boxer. And I see you nodding, Jared. I think you've seen it too.
No, but I've seen of it. I'll put it that way. I haven't actually watched it, but I know of it.
Yeah, all right, all right. So, fantastic show for adults too. And in any case, I figured, well, it's time to get started. You know, it's something I wanted to do for many years. Went to my first boxing class, got too early. My coach didn't tell me that I was early. It was actually the seniors class, or the what we would in boxing you'd call the professionals class. It's the guys who were competing. I couldn't tell the difference though. I was a teen. It was my first class, and he wanted to test me out, so he didn't tell me. So I just got in class with these guys. For the most grueling, terrible 2 hours of my life. I want to die. I have no idea how I survived that. And then following that, they had a regular class, but I just went home. I couldn't. And I was walking home. I was telling myself, I'm never gonna come back. Never gonna come back. But then 3 days later, I came back.
Well, there must have been something there that was kind of drawing you in after taking a beating.
It was wonderful and terrible at the same time. But sometimes you gotta look fear in the eye. You gotta realize that if you want to pursue something that you're really into, some sacrifices have to be made. And I could push myself, and it's very good that I did. Nowadays, I'm saddened that some of the people who come to first class in my school, which is a far friendlier and nicer first class, do not continue because they are physically intimidated, not by violence, but just by the physical challenge of it. And you know, a lot of years have passed since, and I think with each generation now, we're getting less fit, more flaccid, and especially for younger people these days, I get the students who come by their own academy are showing less and less fitness and physical ability. And we as martial arts teacher, we have a responsibility to try to do good for society to help people overcome that trouble. But in any case, after boxing, I had a stint with Okinawan karate for a year and a half. Reason was primarily that I wanted something less sports-like. I really liked the boxing, but I figured out that sports are gonna get you injured. It's a terrible truth, but it has to be told. I mean, if you want to do something like boxing or Thai boxing or even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on a competitive level, you're gonna get injured. And if you care about your health and you want a healthy body for older age, and I had the foresight for that, then it might not be the wisest choice to pursue that. Then again, you can make that sacrifice and have a wonderful experience training for many years, but there would be a cost. So I was looking for something more traditional. I ended up doing Shitoryu Karate, taught very traditionally by a person who's now a friend of mine, it's a Quan sensei. He teaches in Israel and has been to Okinawa many times. And his teaching style is very Okinawan, very traditional, very non-commercialized. I liked it very much also. But throughout my karate experience, I was beginning to get exposed to some more novel and unique literature about the martial arts, which I have not been exposed to before. Because when you do sports martial arts, usually the literature and the videos you're into are about, you see, you're watching fights, you're watching people do strength training and cardio and all that stuff, and you're watching the celebrities mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you do boxing or MMA or anything like that, who do you watch? You watch the Gracies, you watch the Floyd Mayweathers and Manny Pacquiao's and all these guys, but you tend to not focus on people who are not as famous but can teach you more because they're not about being a celebrity or being that fighter. They're about, okay, let me share a video with you. I'm not the world's best fighter, but I can teach you something. And that sort of stuff I got more into when I got into traditional martial arts. And as I was in my karate dojo, I began to notice other things in my surrounding environment. I began to see that, well, there isn't just this kung fu in China. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of styles. Okinawan karate itself can be subdivided to perhaps several dozen lineages. And nowadays, even more organizations, perhaps a few hundred organizations. And you get a sense that the world of martial arts is much broader than you first thought, which I think happens to a lot of people. If they seek out more information, knowledge, they get this feeling throughout their first, second, third year of training in whatever. So then I began seeing some stuff that the Chinese martial arts practitioners were doing that I wouldn't see in my karate, or that the karate people would say, oh, you'd get to this in like 20 or 30 years. But for me, I mean, all right, I'm patient. I'm all in for like doing this thing for 20, 30 years or even more. But what about this stuff? Why can't this be in my karate? And I was drawn to all sorts of stuff. Among other things, like many other people, I've seen that famous Bruce Lee one-inch punch demonstration, which ironically nowadays I don't find that that unique at all. And it's not magical, and it's actually not such a good demonstration of the one-inch punch. I mean, a lot of people do better.
Right.
I could do better with my students nowadays. And if you watch the demo, by the way, it's a good demo. It's a great demo. The guy was a good martial artist and a great actor. But if you watch the demo now with the critical eyes of a martial arts teacher, then you're seeing other things. For instance, you see that the guy who's being punched by Bruce Lee, first of all, he's totally cooperative, and he's standing with his legs shoulder width apart, with his legs pointing just the right way to be pushed by the punch. I mean, I could make this exact demonstration with any one of my students. It's just really easy. If you just take a guy, put him shoulder width apart, with the heels narrower than the toes, this reverse triangle shape. It's really easy to just bounce him into that chair in the back. They had to rehearse it, of course, but it's not that impressive of a demonstration. But it is a nice demo, and it has affected me when you see such things. And I also saw Chen Xiaowang. Chen Xiaowang is a famous teacher of Chen-style Taiji Chuan. And I saw him fighting, releasing these short bars, and just seeing all these guys and a lot more videos like that, I figured I want to do stuff like this. This draws me in. There's something about this type of movement that I'm attracted to, and I had a tough time breaking up and breaking apart with the Okinawan karate because it is effective. It is very fun to train. And my teacher, Quan sensei, is just a fantastic teacher. I like him very much. And he taught me so much about life. And nowadays, interestingly enough, my teaching is probably more affected by his teaching method and his attitude, his Okinawan attitude, than it is by my later teachers. So anyhow, from that I got to my main teacher, Shifu Nitan Oren. Shifu Nitan had been practicing the arts for several decades, and he lived in Tianjin City Tianjin is a very large city in China for roughly 13 to 15 million people. It's basically a country of a city.
Right.
It has its own government. Yeah, and you should see the subway they have now. I mean, puts the stuff from New York and Europe to shame, really. I've been to Rome and New York, and you're just seeing this subway in Tianjin nowadays. They've got this when the thing goes underground, and the windows don't have any view, so they have these 3D holograms coming out of the windows as commercials. And you're like, God damn, this is the future. This is China, and then you go out the subway, and people let their kids shit on the street.
Right.
They're all farmers not that long ago, so they still have that mindset. So anyhow, my teacher Shifu, he had lived in Tianjin for 7 years, and all these years he studied daily with his teacher, Master Zhou Jingxuan. It's Joe. It's like Joe in America. It sounds roughly the same. Jingxuan is his private name, and Master Joe unfortunately had passed away a while back. He suffered a stroke, and due to mistreatment at the hospital, they made him into vegetables. And in China, they have a different outlook on human life. So if you're in a vegetative state at a hospital, or you're brain dead, or anything like that, they let your family choose whether they want to keep you alive or let you die with dignity. And his family chose. I mean, the guy did martial arts from age 9 for many decades, and just figured he wouldn't have liked to live like that. So they let him pass away peacefully in his sleep, which I think is a good thing under the circumstances. But I was also fortunate, besides studying with Shifu, who had studied with Master Joe for 7 years straight, I've also studied with Master Joe on several occasions. I've spent roughly 6 months of my life living in China, and it was quite an experience. We can talk about that later. So from Shifu, I studied chiefly Xing Yichuan, which is a Northern Chinese internal martial art. We can talk about that later. And I also studied from him a bit of Pigua Zhang, which is another Northern Chinese martial art, not internal. We'll talk about the external term stuff later also. And the rest of my Pigua I studied with Master Zhong in China. And then I also eventually ended up studying Southern Mantis of the Juklum lineage. Juklum is in Cantonese. The terms which I mentioned before are in Mandarin Chinese. You got Mandarin-speaking Chinese that comes primarily from the north, and Cantonese, which is the most common dialect in southern China. And nowadays the Chinese government is trying to convert all of the Chinese to only speak Mandarin, and they're probably, because it's a dictatorship, they'll probably be successful at that eventually, and it's in the works. And so the Southern Mantis system from southern China, and my teacher in that system is Sifu Sapir Tal, a direct disciple of Grandmaster Henry Pui, who lives and teaches still in Texas. So let's move on.
So that's kind of all over the place for your martial arts there.
Yeah.
So you teach them now. Which ones do you actually teach?
I teach the Xing Yi Chuan and the Pigua Zhang. Now we're about the Chuan and the Zhang at the end. Xing Yi is form and intent, and Chuan is fist. So the fist of form and intent, and Pigua, it's not the same Gua as in Bagua. People often confuse it. In the Gua in Bagua Zhang, they mean the Gua of the 8 trigrams. That's this Gua. The Gua in Pigua is hanging. It's like hanging power, when you hang on to the opponent's movement or momentum. And P is to chop or to split or to axe. Like an axe-like movement. So the hanging, splitting palm. Zhang is palm. So in China, in Japan, what they do is they use the word ryu. Ryu is a school of something, a lineage, a style of something. Or they use the word do. In Chinese, is Dao, which is way. So judo, the soft way. Or they use jutsu, as in jujutsu, the soft technique. Jutsu is technique. In China, oftentimes they use either chuan, which is fist, at the end of a name of it out, or they use zhang, which is palm. And this is supposed to denote whether the art uses more fist or more palm techniques. but it's just arbitrary. It's generic. Some arts have Zhang at the end, some arts have Trin, and the thing coming before the Trin or the Zhang is the actual name of the art.
Okay. Well, when you teach them, because those are two completely different arts, do you teach them as separate classes, or do you mix them all together, or how do you do that?
Okay. I'm not into the MMA approach. I wouldn't teach traditional. Yeah, I wouldn't teach two traditional martial arts together because, like all traditionalists, I'm a big believer that you have to come to embody one art before you can pursue another successfully. You can, theoretically, and it's put to practice in modern MMA, you can teach a lot of arts in parallel. You end up with a lot of techniques, but your body method is confused and mixed up, and you can fight with it well, but you never make it into an art, because an art requires that you go and abide by the rules of the art. And these rules in traditional martial arts, whether they're Indonesian or Chinese or Japanese or whatever, these rules and methods and ways of training is what makes the art an art. You know, if these arts weren't different, then we wouldn't have martial arts. We just have fighting. And in MMA nowadays, you oftentimes you only have fighting. So it's okay to study more than one martial art, but you have to do quite a number of years, depending on the art. In my opinion, anywhere between 4 and 7 years in your art. If you practice continuously, 4 to 7 years. If you really arrive at every class and you practice at home, etc., etc. And then you can go about studying another art, again, depending on who you are and how well you got that transmission. So the way I teach, I have separate groups for the Xing and the Pigua. Different crowds, different people, you know, because the Xing I teach extremely traditionally. This means that throughout the first year and a half, they don't do a lot. They don't study a lot of material. They focus on the basics. And it gets really hardcore. I mean, I get people practicing Zhang. For those who don't know, Zhang is a practicing method when you hold one posture. And there's a lot of internal training inside of it, but basically you stand in one place in a difficult posture. And I get people to stand like that in one place in a difficult posture for maybe 40 minutes. And people get to 40 minutes sometimes within 1 to 3 months. And oftentimes people say, like, you couldn't stand in one posture, a low posture for 40 minutes. But you can. I've made quite a lot of people achieve that, and it's not that difficult. Complete beginners can do it. However, to do such things which are very traditional and are very important for the Xing to actually work as a martial art, you need a certain mindset. I mean, you cannot take the average 14, 15, 16-year-old teenager and make him stand in one place for 40 minutes. It's just not going to work. It doesn't work in China either, that some of these arts, the Xing, usually in China, they do teach kids that art sometimes, but usually it's after the age of 18. Some exceptional young men or women can do it from maybe 16, and if it's inside the family, if you get taught by your father or uncle and stuff like that, maybe from a younger age, but usually after the age of 18. The Pigua is very different. I teach it semi-traditionally, meaning that some of the teaching methods are more traditional. Basically, the more advanced the student, the more traditional the training becomes. But for beginner students, it's more like the stereotypical karate class. They might stand behind me and I do movements and they follow. More cardio work, just easier in terms of patience and in terms of the physical and cognitive demands of students. I also teach the arts very differently. The Xing I teach in a very linear manner, meaning you have the strict curriculum and you learn from A to Z, and there's an order for everything. And everything is built on top of one another, even though both of these arts are built on principles. So if you understand one thing, usually later it will be easier for you to understand another thing in the arts. But still, the Xing is from A to Z. They go to study, start with Zhang. They move into the 5 phases, the 5 fists, and then they have a partner form, which is a linking form of the 5 fists. Then they have a solo form linking the 5 fists. Then they have Shili, which are powerful exercises. It's like Zhang in motion. It looks very akin to Tai Chi, just not in as a form. It's just single exercises. It's like if you'd taken one or two free movements from the Taiji form. Taiji, by the way, is Tai Chi. Its correct pronunciation in Mandarin is Taiji, not Tai Chi. And you take these movements and you exercise them repeatedly from anywhere between 10 minutes to an hour or more. And you just have this very straightforward linear curriculum. In the Pigua, the entire art, in terms of its empty hand methods, is based on what's called the 12 hands. 12 hands in my lineage, not particular lineage. And the 12 hands of Pigua, they have variations on them. So all in all, about 40, maybe 42 variations. And they need to learn these 40 variations. However, I do not teach them in a specific order. So every 2 or 3 classes, I would change a variation and we'd focus on another variation. And the way I teach it is we do the solo work, so do this variation practicing in the air by ourselves. And they do the partner work, and it's 50-50. Wherein in the Xing in the beginning, for the first year and a half, maybe 80% of the work, as much as 80% is solo. In the Pigua, just from the start, it's 50-50. 50% solo work and 50% with your partner. And then you'd get this, throughout the year, I would recycle all of these hands and variations, all of these 40 variations. And every time you'd learn a different variation, and they're expected to practice it at home. But these variations are reminiscent of each other, and they explore the same principles. So you might end up drawing a circle of sorts in one direction, and then that circle exists in another variation. It's a totally different technique, but you use the same circle. So you might have not learned that variation before, but because you practiced another one, you can use the same circle now just for a different technique. And what I focus on with the Pigua, I get the internal stuff later, and instead, what I do with the beginner students throughout their first 2 years of training, I teach them to explore movements and to understand how a given movement can be 100 different things. And this is something that's missing from a lot of martial arts teachings. And this is something I picked up mostly from my former teacher, Quan sensei. Again, very influenced by his approach. And he used to show you a kata, and he would show movement, and then he would show 5, 6, 7 different ways to use the same movement in self-defense or combat. And I do the same. I take this variation of 12 hands, say, let's use this hand like this. And it can be, maybe it can be an uppercut, or maybe it can help you release yourself from a hold, or maybe that can even be, it looks like an uppercut, but if you don't use the fist, use the elbow and you add a circle, now it's a takedown or a throw. So don't think of a hand movement or foot movement or body movement as given technique. It can just be anything if you're original enough. And oftentimes you need to get into that combative situation. You need another person to push you into that combative situation to realize, oh, I just used this. I never thought about using it this way, but it was just in my body already. And now I know that I can use it this way too. And I myself, as a teacher, I discover new things in this manner. Oftentimes I demonstrate to students and they're supposed to do something, and then they get nervous because they're afraid to get hit, or they react when they shouldn't have reacted for the sake of the demonstration, and then they force me to change and be original, and suddenly I do something that I have never done before. And then I tell my students, look, he did this and he forced me to do that, and here we go. We got a new application. We haven't explored this before. Now you can do it. Let's do this one. So very free-flowing and cyclical. And you go around the year and you repeat the same things over and over, whilst in the Xing it's not only linear, but every time you don't, it's not cyclical in the manner which that if you progress through a stage, then you have to still like keep practicing the stuff from the previous stage and keep on, you build on the previous foundation, but you keep doing that foundation actually more so than before. And the way I teach the arts too, the way I was taught, there was no strict curriculum. I was just taught stuff based on what my teachers felt was most appropriate for me at the time, for my progression and understanding. And I was expected to remember everything by heart, both in terms of doing the physical movement and remembering the names and the sequences. And rarely did I have to ask my teachers to teach me something again or rarely did I forget something they taught me because they made me repeat it a lot. And I often tell my students the best way to remember something you just got taught is to go home at the same day or the day after and do it for 3 hours. Just take this one movement you learned, one combination or one form. You take that, and that same day later or the next day, in the morning, just do not wait. Do not wait another 2 days or a week to do this stuff. Just as soon as possible, do that thing for 1 to 3 extra hours by yourself, and you'll never forget it. Especially if it's 3 hours, if you can force yourself to do something for 3 hours straight, right after you'd learned it, you'd never forget it. You'd remember it 20 years from now. You might not be able to do it well if you hadn't practiced it, but you'd remember what you had learned. Unfortunately, very few people do that, but sometimes they do manage to force themselves, students to do it for maybe 20, 30 minutes later that day or the next day. And that is very, very helpful for the learning process. So back to the curriculum, there was no strict curriculum, and I was expected to just build it, just understand the structure of the art on my own. I could ask questions, of course, but it was up to me. And then when I started teaching, because I realized most people are not up to this sort of traditional teaching method, what I did was very different. I took the curriculum, and for each of these arts, I constructed 12-stage or 12-level curriculum. And I tell my students, it's not important. The curriculum is not important. The curriculum is there, first of all, so I know when to test you. So we can test you once in a while to just check out your progression, see if you still remember all these things from before. And also so you can know where you're at the curriculum, so you don't have to remember it all by heart. And I put this 12-stage curriculum for each of these arts. I just printed it and put it on the wall of the academy so everyone can see it. Everyone knows where they're at. It's very clear, and my testing can get quite rigorous. The way I test students, whenever they want to test for the next level, which only means they don't get a belt or anything. We don't use a belt system, and no one is carrying a mark on him or herself telling what grade they are. They just know it by heart. Sometimes I even forget. They have to tell me. Because when you have a lot of students, you tend to forget if you don't have these belts. And I tend to think, these belts and all these grades, they're more for the teachers than they are for the students. I mean, the teachers get forgetful. So, in any case, whenever they have to test for the next level, the next stage, they have to demonstrate everything they've learned up to that stage so far. And they also need to know at least 1 or 2 applications for each and every movement in the system. They have to know how everything works. I wasn't taught that way. A lot of the things which I had learned from all of my teachers, I was not explained applications for, which is fine, by the way, because if you explore things combatively for enough years, you do realize the applications later on for most things. And if you don't, then you come, after a while, you come to your teacher and you ask him, and he just tells you and explains it. But oftentimes in class, you miss out on a lot of the art's potential, and I make sure that they know how every single movement is used, and they have to demonstrate it when they're tested. And the more advanced you are, the more applications you have to show for a given movement. And I don't get too obsessed with it. You don't get to, you're not required to show 300 applications for a given movement, but you have to know at a certain stage you have to know at least 4. And sometimes for certain movements, I haven't taught them 4 applications for that movement. Sometimes they only know 2. But then in the midst of that test, they have to improvise. And sometimes they get stuck. So what I do is I tell their partner, okay, just try to do a double leg takedown from MMA. And let the other guy see how he's going to use that movement against that. And then once you got that combative scenario, then it comes to him that, hey, I can use it, and then the movement just comes naturally, and he can use it, even if the other guy is really trying to get him. So that's roughly how I work with these arts and the manner in which I teach them. And also, something else I find really important with traditional arts such, because people study in groups, mostly and I was taught by all of my teachers in the Chinese arts, mostly one-on-one or in very small groups. So I let my students access their teaching in a private manner also. If you're a regular student in the academy, you can come train with me any day. During my own private training time, you can train beside me. Sometimes you train with me if you're more advanced. And while I'm resting or I just have a break, I'm just going to correct you or teach you something extra. And those students who try more, who make more of an effort to learn, I make more of an effort to teach them. And they come, and they might come when I teach a different group. And whilst I teach the group, if everyone's busy and I've just finished correcting everyone, then I'm going off to the side to teach that other guy from that other group who came to study more. He wants to train more. He wants to take the art. He wants to be serious about it. Then I owe him that sort of attention. I find it important, and I find it more important than having all these private class students pay me money, extra money, which could be really nice. However, I would prefer to have a lot of students who are advanced in the arts, which is better for me and for the academy. Less for my bank account. However, in the long term, that's more important.
Well, you mentioned that traditionally the kids aren't really taught in there too much in the traditional Chinese martial arts. Do you have a because we've talked about this a bunch on the show, do you have a kids part of your class? Or your curriculum, I should say?
I wouldn't teach Xing to kids. I had one guy who started Xing. He's still with me when he was 16 and a half. He's now 19 and a half. Mm-hmm. And this was an exception. He was a bit more mature for his age. And also at the time, I had very few students. I had maybe 3 students, 4 students. So he was taught semi-privately. I could give him as much attention as he required at the time. So that was an exception. But I wouldn't teach Xing to kids. They couldn't take it cognitively. They're not built to handle any meditative states, so you can teach them the Jianzhuang, and without the Jianzhuang, there's no Xingyi. The art just wouldn't work, and we'd just be playing. And the Pigua, I do teach kids. I've not had a lot of success teaching kids younger than 10. However, from age 10 to 13, I have a group that's 10 to 13. And from age 14, what I do is I put them in the adults group because I feel that they are mature enough to handle the adult world. And you know, that being a teenager and just this concept of adolescence is 20th century, some say 19th century invention. We didn't have that. You know, in Judaism, you have bar mitzvah at 13. What does it mean? You know, the father says in the bar mitzvah ceremony, he says, Baruch sheptaranu me'onsho shel zeh, which is crazy, some crazy talk in Hebrew, but it means bless us for getting rid of this guy, essentially. because what it meant traditionally is that by 13, the kid, the boy, is no longer a boy. He's now a man. He's expected to have man chores and duties. And by the way, women in Judaism get the bat mitzvah, which is the bar mitzvah equivalent for females, at 12, which suggests that Judaism, you know, it admits that girls become more mature earlier than boys, right?
Right.
And so by 14, so after 13, when they are physically and emotionally mature enough, I just stick them with the adults and they have to deal with it. 10 to 13, I have these kids, been successful at teaching them Pigua, but not as traditional as I would have liked it to be. And they have a very difficult time with abstract movements. So if they have to work it out in the air, it's very difficult for them to handle abstract subjects and just moving the body in a way that's not giving them physical feedback, direct physical feedback. So I moved from doing that to mostly doing partner work with the kids, and that had been more successful. And I think that as much as I would have liked to teach them more traditionally, if they're not my own kids or if in the family or kids of close friends of mine, and I can take them and make sure they practice at home a lot and they do what's required in the traditional training setting, then at that age they're better off doing mostly partner work and it's also good for them because that teaches them self-defense earlier, and they can handle themselves better in school.
Okay, well, that kind of makes sense. I kind of piggybacking off that same question. You mentioned that you have tests, but you really don't have like the belt system. Do you have, I don't know, for lack of a better term, a rank system where you're a student and then you become an instructor? Have you had any students actually go through like that?
Well, they, like I said, they have the levels, they have the grades. So someone would say like I'm level 4
Okay.
out of 12. By grade 7 or 8, they can assist me in class.
Okay.
And maybe replace me if I want to take a vacation. I haven't taken a vacation since I started teaching because I was telling my students, look, I can't just leave you guys be for a week or two because there's no one to teach in my stead. So, but hopefully soon enough, when someone reaches level 7 or 8, they can teach in my stead for at least a week or so. I wouldn't let them teach for more than that, and maybe they can teach kids classes, perhaps, depending on who's the guy. And level 10 is when you get to be Shifu. When I tell you, okay, you can just take the art and teach it, but you would still have to teach it the way you were taught. Mm-hmm. But then from level 12, you can teach the art the way you want to teach it, whatever. You can do whatever you want. Because I find that the traditional arts, if you don't want them to be petrified, if you don't want them to be an anachronistic remnant of the past, they have to change, they have to evolve. And I do not have a monopoly over truth. And everyone has their own ideas and opinions and personal evolution to put into the mix. So by the time you reach what's the so-called level 12, I mean, you're quote unquote my successor. I don't like these words because I'm no master or grandmaster or anything like that, but you're my successor in the sense that you can take the art and do whatever with it. You are mature enough in your understanding of the practice that I don't need to tell you what to do anymore. You can teach the art, you can change it completely. I trust in your judgment, even if it's something I don't like, that's your choice. So now beyond these things, there's also at level 5 or 6, it changes between Chini and Pigua, depending on just the curriculum and how much effort they've put in by that stage. Anyone who wants to, I don't force it on students, they can become my disciples. Currently, I only have one disciple, and there are about 4 people who might get to become my disciples come summer. And this means that you've been in my academy for long enough, and we've built a relationship based on trust and mutual understanding, and that I can trust you as family. And I want to accept you as my own family, as my adopted sons, or maybe if you're older, as my adopted relative. So you're my blood. I say in the ceremony when I accept them as disciples, we are not the same blood, but now we are one. You came as a student, but now you are family. And these words mean a lot to me, and this is a very big commitment in the world of traditional Chinese martial arts. If you accept someone as a disciple, now forever, until the day they die, even if you quit training, even if they quit training, even if you both quit training, you have a family bond, and it means that you owe to them what you owe to your own blood relatives, which hopefully you're not fighting with over stuff, and you can't, and it's a very sacred institution, it's a very serious ceremony, and they do it in front of all the rest of the students, and it's advertised publicly, so people would know this student is now my disciple. It doesn't mean he's a teacher now. Actually, it doesn't have anything to do with teaching or teaching ability or even with martial arts ability, apart from knowing a certain level of the curriculum, which is just to make sure that they've stuck with me long enough and had shown enough dedication to learn to a point to which I can trust them. And this is based on personal trust between two people, and the idea that they accept that they're closer to me now and I'm closer to them, and they can call in 4 a.m. and tell me, I need you right now to fix my roof. I need you right now because my wife left me, or anything. And I'll be there, and they do the same for me. And that's it. And it's very important, and I feel it strengthens my relationship and bond with the more serious students. And of course, once this ceremony has taken place, they have to put more effort into training, and I have to put more effort into teaching them.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about the book, because that's kind of how we got introduced to each other anyway. It was through the book here.
Yeah, sure.
Your book, Research on Martial Arts, is a nice, big, thick book that goes through a lot of different pieces, and I really appreciated reading it. It was it took me a while because it's dense material. They've got a lot packed in there. So let me ask you a little bit about, first of all, kind of why you wrote it. What were you trying to convince? What were you trying to explain with the book?
All right, let's get to it like step by step. Let's talk first about why was this book written. So I can see now that you've got a library behind you of likely mostly martial arts books.
Yeah, that's my martial arts library behind me there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you know all too well that oftentimes you have to read a book that's 100, 200, 400 pages long, only to get these 4 or 5 paragraphs out of it that really change your outlook and from which you really got a novel understanding of the arts. And I had the same experience like yourself and like many other martial artists. I had found myself reading all these books, but each and every one of these books was giving me a certain perspective, mostly from a teacher and how he teaches or a given style. None of these books really sought out to explain the martial arts as they are. They're just, I'm going to explain Taiji to you. I'm going to give you a bunch of interviews. I'm going to tell you how to do your strength training more effectively. But what you really want as a martial artist is to have order. You just want someone to come and tell you, look, this is how all these martial arts relate together. This is how your teacher taught certain techniques. This is how these relate to biology, physiology, kinesiology, to health, to the strength training, to what other teachers teach, to this and that traditions, to history. And no one was making these connections. At most, they'd write a chapter or two about these connections, but no more. Rarely does it appear in martial arts literature. And I really looked into writing a book which is a so-called unifying theory, like they want to do in physics. Mm-hmm. They want to create. Sorry, I have to close my windows. It's getting stormy here. Just a second.
No problem.
So I really sought out to write a book which is a sort of a unified theory for the martial arts. A book that can explain the relationship between different traditions from different countries and shine light on the histories of these arts and how these histories created body mechanics and training methods and how all of these relate and connect together. And I got to all of this through the study and research of what's called so-called internal and external. Now, what are internal and external? These are made-up terms. They didn't exist much in the martial arts before the end of the 19th century. People were just busy doing their thing. You did this art or that art, and you had no classification because each art had its own unique specialized terminology. You do have in a country setting, you have in Japan, and you have in China and Indonesia, and you have in Europe terminologies which are specific to these countries and regions. So the arts coming from these countries and regions share similar terminologies. Like in Chinese, you have mabu. It's horse staff, and people call it horse stance. This is something common in most of the Chinese traditional arts, and they all know what it is. But in terms of actual training theory and training methods, the arts could vary quite significantly, and they weren't talking about families of arts or how the arts relate together, just everyone were doing their thing. Part of it was because, in China at least, most of the martial arts teachers were illiterate. Now, it wasn't so uncommon in China to be illiterate, especially since Chinese is a very challenging and difficult language. If you want to learn Chinese, then you don't have an alphabet. Every word is a symbol, is a drawing. So you want to learn Chinese to just a basic level. You want to read a Chinese newspaper. You have to learn 5,000 drawings or 6,000 drawings, and you want to learn Chinese to a very high level, you have to learn maybe 18 or 19,000 of these drawings. And if you want to learn how to draw something, as you know, you have to do it repeatedly for a long time. So you spend a lot of time, years actually, many years, to just repeating the drawings of these characters, the Chinese characters. So in Japan, it's the same. We study grammar and speech and such, whether in Hebrew or in English. When do you finish the study in the States? At what grade?
As far as grammar goes, probably about 12th grade. So about
12th grade.
17, 18, something like that.
Yeah. It's here in Israel. It's by 11th grade. Mm-hmm. So in China, you don't. You go to college and you keep studying it, and you become a professor, and you're still studying the language because it's so complex, and you have to still keep drawing all these characters and study them, and it's just so much work. And you didn't have that many teachers, so in China, quite a lot of people were illiterate, martial artists included, and there was also a wide gap between the literati, which were often most commonly Confucians, and those who practice martial arts, because Confucianism looks down on the practice of the martial arts, mostly, with perhaps the exception of archery. But the rest of the martial arts is deemed very physical, very barbaric, very primitive. The virtuous man, Confucius's virtuous man, the moral individual, the sage perhaps, is not a person who cultivates himself by pursuing something which is violent, so to speak. So traditionally the Confucians, who ruled China for quite a number of years, for thousands of years with intermittent periods, they were the most influential clerks in court, in the imperial court often, and these people had a dislike for the martial arts. So martial artists, even when they were quite educated, they were shoved to the edges of society. They were not considered to be, they could not be aristocrats usually, and they were not considered the educated elite. They could not be a part of that. And when you had these Manchurian princes in the last dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty, it's the last imperial regime that was in China from 1644 to 1911. You had some of these Manchurians studying the martial arts as a pastime, and it was just that. It was a pastime. They wouldn't be full-time martial artists because this was not a dignified thing to do. All right, so a lot of these martial artists were illiterate, and by the end of the 19th century, there had come about a more literate bunch. Among them, a famous teacher of Xing called Sun Lutang. Sun Lutang is a very famous teacher of the internal arts, and he also practiced and taught Pigua Zhang and Taiji Chuan. Mm-hmm. And he has his own lineage in all of these arts, Sun-style Xing and Taiji, and Sun-style Pigua, which are still being taught throughout China and even in the West today. He and many of his colleagues at the time sought to distinguish themselves from people teaching other arts. And they just happened to mostly teach Xing and Taiji and Pigua. And they had their own private schools, or they were connected with private schools teaching the martial arts. So they called themselves the internal group of martial arts. The so-called internal as in inside our group. Or they also related their arts to Wudang, to the Wudang temple complex and mountain. However, nowadays we know that this is false because all of these arts did not have their origins in Wudang. As a matter of fact, of the thousands of Chinese martial arts, very few of them came from either Wudang or Shaolin directly. So it was actually at a very later period, much later period, during the 70s and the 80s, that a lot of Chinese arts came to Shaolin and Wudang, and the new monks there started practicing them, and then it came about that people began to associate these arts with these temple complexes. So, for instance, today in the Wudang mountain and temple complex, you've got people teaching Xingyi and Taiji and Bagua and even Baji Chuan, which is an orphan Chinese martial art from the area of Mengzong village. And none of these arts came from Wudang. Wudang had its own traditions, like a very famous Jian sword method that was passed on by General Li Jingling. Li Jingling was a famous general who had been famous in martial arts circles for his Jian skills, his skills with the Chinese straight sword. And he was a contemporary and friend and colleague of Sun Lutang, and he was of that milieu. Because these guys called themselves the internal group, then all of the other arts by default became the external group. But now over the years, this had evolved to a more sophisticated distinction. So instead of just being like this external art and that internal art, these terms became more about training methods. So over the years and up to our time, a lot of training methods became distinguished as being called either external or internal. And the internal and external arts are not, there is no art purely internal or external. You only have a lot of methods so-called external classified as such, and you have many methods called internal classified as such, and then arts using mostly the internal methods are what I would call internally oriented arts. And arts using mostly what you would call the external methods are externally oriented arts, and you got these arts in between. So let's give some examples.
Okay.
So easier to give examples from the so-called external methods, externally oriented arts. So you got running for cardiovascular fitness. You got rope jumping. You got weightlifting. You got this speed training, speed bag training. All of these things are so-called external methods. They look to externally apparent characteristics. So you jump rope, you align yourself with it's about you and the rope, right? You are you against an external object. You're doing strength training. It's about activating big and small muscle groups, but in a way that you can see, right? So you observe which group of muscle is working. Usually, especially with the influence of bodybuilding, people would say, like, I would work my quadriceps, now I'm working my biceps, etc. These sorts of methods look to the outside. And the internal methods tend to be different, more holistic. We're talking about various Qigong methods. We're talking about Zhanzhuang. We're talking about using intention, which is a subject thoroughly covered in my book. The use of intention is a key element in the internal arts. You talk about learning how to move your body like a great ocean from the inside. And a lot of things that go into the inside of the body often have meditative qualities, are more about moving your energy inside of yourself. Not talking about anything mystical here, just sometimes just kinetic energy, not looking to the external. If you look at, let's pick just two different arts. Let's talk about Western boxing and Taiji Chuan, which are very extreme examples for a very externally oriented art and a very internally oriented art.
Right.
So you got boxers, and a boxer would say, I need to be faster than my opponent. Why? Because I want to evade that punch. I need to be faster than the punch. I need to be able to respond quicker to that punch. I need to teach my body to move very quickly. And to do that, I need to move very quickly. You look at Taiji Chuan, and it says something very different. It says, okay, you need to be fast. It's important. In martial arts, in fighting, you need to be fast. But it's not as important because if I can touch my opponent, if I get to the point where I touch him, then I can control him and slow him down. Instead of being faster than him, I slow him down to my pace, to my rhythm, to my speed, and that way I control him. In boxing, that type of control is done from afar, and really good boxers, they have this almost psychic telekinetic ability to signal to their opponent the rhythm they want him to move at. If you do boxing and you do sparring in boxing for a while, then you know this exists, and you notice how people do that. And it's not something that has a specific training method for it. You just a lot of partner work, a lot of sparring, and you just learn that. And boxers, with their gloves on, they're not touching someone with their fingers or their palms, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a lot of touch going on, and if two people touch, then they're broken apart very quickly. In the internal arts like Taiji, you try to maintain the touch for as long as necessary to make your technique work. Whatever you want to do, whether it's a punch, a lock, a takedown, a throw, whatever. They're very different mindset. The boxer doesn't want to get touched. The Taiji guy wants to get touched. Leads to very different training methods. The boxer wants to just be that fly in the air, that fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee, right?
Right.
And the Taiji guy is talking about an ocean. He wants to be like an ocean wrapping around his opponent. He wants the opponent to feel him as if the opponent is drowning in quicksand or being engulfed by the waves. If you want to do these very different things in your fighting game, then you train very differently. And if you want to do something very delicate, if you want to make a technique work at a very minute level, changing your opponent's center of gravity by just touching them very lightly, controlling the way they feel and think through touch, and you want to do these things with the internal arts, then as in Taiji, you have to practice very slowly. Because only when you practice very slowly for very long periods of time, and you do this over years, then you have the capacity to pay attention to the inner workings of your own body and where you're at in space. Which for a boxer it matters less, because as long as you evaded the punch, you evaded the punch. You're not trying to work all these little internal things like the Taiji guy does. Also, another difference, the boxer says, I want to develop my punching power. What ought I do? I ought to do strength training because I need strong muscles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I need to work on my speed because speed multiplied by my mass equals more power. I want to punch the heavy bag. Because naturally, if you punch something a lot of times, you get better at punching. Supposedly, that's the thinking. And it works in the context of boxing. Works great. I mean, we got Mike Tyson. How can I agree with that, right? So it does work. It's not a false paradigm. It's just a way of doing things. And in the internal arts, you do things differently. You say, okay, but if I punch the bag all the time, it tenses me up. If you're punching the bag continuously, you don't get softer, you get stiffer. And then you take a minute break and you do it for another 3 minutes because that's what you do in boxing. But no, you don't want to be stiff. Why? Because from the Taiji perspective, that's not how you want to fight, A. And B, being stiff is not good for your soul. And that's universally accepted. I mean, that doesn't have to... If you go to yoga and you go to any tradition of meditation whatsoever, Western or Eastern, you seek to become softer, not stiffer. Stiffness is associated with death. Softness is associated with childbirth, the baby. The softest moment of yourself after you're born, you're the softest. And in the East, they sought to be more like the baby and less like the muscular adult. In Greece and in Rome, you see all these statues of very muscular men. And the women are very impressive figures on their own, in their own right. But in the East, you see these fat Buddhas. They're obese. And you ask them, why are they worshipping these fat Buddhas? Can't you see that this Buddha is obese? Can't you see that Buddha has been to McDonald's way too many times? This guy's gonna die. He's gonna have a bypass tomorrow. And you work him to die. And on top of that, you bring him fruit. You feed the guy. You feed him more. What the hell are you thinking? But it's not about that at all. Because the Western people are influenced by Greek and Roman traditions. So they see a fat Buddha. Why can't he be a muscular Buddha? Why can't that Buddha go to the gym? But in Eastern thought, it's not about him being fat. It's him resembling a baby, because a baby is the purest form of human potential. The baby is the softest. The baby can become anything he wants, almost.
Right.
So the boxer wants, he's punching this bag, he's punching it, he's getting stronger and more muscular. And also, he gets softer in his techniques to an extent, but he's tense. All boxers are extremely tense compared to proper practitioners of the internal Chinese martial arts. So earlier we were talking about externally oriented and internally oriented methods. I do have to emphasize that by that, neither internal nor external means superior, and that the usage of these terms is to merely understand the similarities and differences between the various arts. This is important to clarify because there are a lot of politics in the world of martial arts, and some of these politics are about which style is supposedly superior to one some other style or all other styles, And this is just silly talk. It's not that the styles or the arts that make anything superior. There are superior fighters, but it's comparing, apples and oranges. And the world is just full of just these wonderful martial traditions, and we ought not be fighting about such silly things. Is that just to give you examples? If you are to do Muay Thai or Western boxing, it is likely that within 6 to 12 months you can fight someone for real, which is good. It gives you a certain level of martial ability really quickly. But then again, you do these arts for a certain number of years, and a lot of people get stuck. They get stuck in a way that they have reached their peak genetic fitness, or they want more, they want something more. Maybe they want more techniques. Maybe they want some spiritual aspect to it. Maybe they want to learn how to breathe right, just beyond the context of actual fighting. Just how am I breathing in my daily life? Is this helping me to breathe in daily life? Yeah, you improved your oxygen consumption, but this is one thing. But what about the breathing itself? I want to have an art and a practice which would aid me remain healthy and vigorous in older age. Maybe I'm nearing the age of 40 or 50 or 60 years old, and perhaps now the Muay Thai and the boxing wouldn't quite cut it for my needs at these ages. So all these types of arts might not have what I'm looking for. And then you have Taiji Chuan, which might have all these things that I've just talked about and would give you all of that. But then again, if you want to learn how to fight and defend yourself, well, it will take a while longer. And between 3 to 10 years, depending on your teacher, lineage, and your personal interest in actual fighting. So the different arts will give you different things, and it's important to know which art you want to learn and for which and what reason, and also who you're studying with, because teachers are very different. I know Western boxing teachers who would not make you world champion, but would make you a better human being and would help you find yourself in the world. And there are also those who would just be interested in getting your money or getting you to be the next champion. If you want that, that's excellent. If you are looking for something else, maybe you ought to look for a different coach, a different teacher. And that pertains to all of the arts. So it's more about your relationship with the art and your relationship with the teacher and the people and the school and the lineage you choose to study with, rather than who is best, which is just silly. That's guerrilla talk. It's two male gorillas fighting in the forest.
That's a good analogy. I like that one.
And unfortunately, we have that so much, and we as martial artists and martial arts teachers are sometimes also at fault here, because we encourage it without noticing. When we share all these MMA fights with these MMA fighters, may they be men or women, oftentimes they encourage that sort of talk and culture. Oh, I'm the best. I'm cyborg. I'm this. I'm that. I mean, what the hell? You're a human being. I'm a human being. Why can't we talk? Why is that about all of that guerrilla talk? Why can't we be fighters and also be cultured? And some of the MMA fighters and the professional sports fighters are like that. They're very cultured, and other times it's just, two gorillas in the forest. It's better for your soul. Okay, that's all right, but how is it better for combat? If your muscles are relaxed, they can actually contract more. If your muscle is already somewhat stiff, if it's already part contracted, then say your muscle is 50% contracted, then it only has another 50% to go. But if your muscle is only 5% contracted, and we have to maintain a level of stiffness a level of, not stiffness, give me another word for that.
How about tension?
That was what I was looking for. We have to maintain a level of tension to keep alive. Even when we are sleeping and it looks as if we're almost dead, we still have a level of tension running through our body, because without tension we are dead. Nothing's working, right? Our blood has to flow, right? The lymph has to flow. The nervous system has to work. All of these things need a certain level of tension. So everyone has tension. There is no, I work with the chi. No, you have chi, okay, but your muscles are always at work. It's just a question of how much are they working. So back to the subject, a boxer might be 50% activated already, then he has another 50%. Now, if he's Mike Tyson, then his other 50% is enough to knock someone out, no problem. But if he's a regular person and not a monster, then a regular person might not be able to do as well with his extra 50%. Maybe that person wants to go the internal route and then only be 10% active, and then when he punches, he wants to activate the other 90%. And then he has more activation because he was more relaxed to begin with. So the internal Chinese martial arts, they say something interesting. They say, you don't want to just increase your potential. Increasing your potential is having a stronger heart, having bigger muscles, running faster, being faster, all of these things. You actually want to invest more effort and time at becoming a more lubricated, a more efficient machine. So if we're talking about machines, the analogy would be that the externalist would think more of, okay, I got this machine, I'm just going to add more gears. I'm going to add more horsepower. And the internalist would say, you can add some stuff. That's okay. This is important. But overall, if I oil the machine better, if I make its working process more efficient, if I change the direction of the gears and their alignment and make the machine work in a very novel way in which it hadn't worked before, which might not be natural in the sense of natural like we operate in our daily lives, but it's more efficient and works better for combat, then I can take the same machine, the same body, and take him very far, both in terms of health and cognitive and his cognitive abilities and his spiritual progress, and of course combat. The internally oriented arts think in terms and concepts related to Taoism, and in the Tao Te Ching it says the sage seeks to diminish, not to add. So the externally oriented arts and externalists often seek to add. They want more methods. They want more this, more that. And in the internally oriented arts, oftentimes you seek to diminish. It's amazing how, through the years, if you train correctly and you have good teachers, you realize that you're much softer than you were before, and often you feel much weaker. You do feel weaker before you make contact with someone because your muscles are not as tense. And you tense your muscles when you want to feel strong, but might not be the right solution always. But through this so-called weakness, through this diminishing, you actually become stronger. And this is, by the way, something I tell my students. When we want to hold on to something emotionally or cognitively, we think of something, I want to kill someone. You really want to kill that guy in line in Walmart, he really pissed you off. You want to kill that bastard, but you don't want to end up in jail. So what do? You reach your hands up in the air and you grab into the air and you just imagine like you're choking him. Yeah, it's a very, very human thing to do. What did you just do? You wanted to hold on to something or someone, right? You wanted to hold on to the feeling of just hurting that guy because he just pissed you off quite a lot. And what you did was you tensed yourself up to simulate that. This example was of yourself tensing up in a manner which is very overt, right? But oftentimes, you tense up inside of your body without even noticing. So suddenly you get pissed or you get stressed. You get anxious. Maybe your digestion doesn't work well. Why didn't it work well? Why do you go test? You go for a test, university or high school, elementary school, and you feel a stomach ache. Something that shouldn't have tensed up inside the body is tensing up. it's blocking the proper function of your digestive system because you have stress. And to deal with the stress, you have to feel it. And to feel things, human tense up something inside themselves. And then, if they don't know how to let go intuitively, or they are taught how to, then they can keep the tension for life. Some people keep their tension until they're dead. They had issues with their parents, with loved ones. They had issues with someone who ridiculed them in high school, and they live up to 90 years old and they die with that tension. They literally, because you become tense when you're dead, you still have the tension when you are a corpse.
Right.
So, and it goes to the grave with you. So the internally oriented arts are very much interested in letting go of these excess tensions, which oftentimes you carry for months and years, because they gather that this aids you in becoming a better human being and a better martial artist. And this is something that is not at all addressed in the vast majority of schools of externally oriented arts. Once in a while, you have a teacher of the externally oriented arts who might be also a yoga teacher, or someone who is extensively trained in meditation or something like that. So that person would input these sorts of things into his teaching sometimes. But more often than not, these things are missing because you came here to be fit and to know how to fight. You're here to become a better human being in the same sense of the word that I've just described.
Right.
Yeah, just a moment. My cat is going nuts here. It's his, that's his playtime. He just decided that's his playtime.
Yep. I understand. I got cats too.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Well, let me ask you then, because we were talking about, you gave the examples of the extremes of the Western boxing and of the Tai Chi. Most arts are probably going to be somewhere in between, where they get little bits and pieces of both. Can you give me an example of how an art would have both of those pieces in it?
Yeah, sure. So maybe the best example would be Wing Chun. Now, Wing Chun is nearly as broad as in Kung Fu, because Wing Chun has just so many lineages and schools and organizations. Wing Chun was probably the most political martial art on the face of the planet.
And that's saying something for martial arts.
Yeah, so if we're not to count MMA as a martial arts phenomenon, then Wing Chun is definitely the next in line. There's so much politics in that, and I would not be getting into that in this interview. But in any case, in Wing Chun, you got people who are very much externally oriented and people who are nearly internally oriented. It just depends on the person. So Wing Chun has elements from both approaches, which is why I would call it, usually, not always, a combination style. Combination style is more balanced in terms of how much it uses externally oriented approaches and methods and internally oriented ones. So let's give some examples. So Wing Chun would have a lot of training, oftentimes if they teach sparring and they teach fighting, which might be akin to what we talked to with boxing. But Wing Chun also has elements very common and akin to what you see in the internally oriented arts. So for instance, in Wing Chun, you stick to your opponent and you attempt to stick to your opponent with softness. And that's not to say that everyone who practices Wing Chun are soft. Some of these people are very muscular guys. Nothing wrong with being muscular, but they're also very stiff. Okay? So you can say there is muscular and not stiff. You can watch a guy like Dr. John P. Painter from the United States who teaches Bagua. And this guy is big. I mean, he's big now. I think he's in his 60s. But when he was in his 30s, 40s, 50s, I've seen pictures. The guy looks like a national level bodybuilder. He's a big guy. And yet, when you see him work, he's very soft. So that can be achieved. It's just very difficult. However, in Wing Chun, some people achieve this softness, some do not. So a friend of mine is Master Keith Kernspecht. Keith Kernspecht. He's from Germany. He has likely the largest martial arts organization in the world today, with over 1,000 schools in Europe. It's quite an effort, quite a lifetime achievement. And he's not young guy. I mean, he's 71 years old, and he worked his entire life at that. very skilled and educated fellow, and this guy is very soft with his Wing Chun. And as a matter of fact, he had also studied many of the internally oriented arts, such as Xing, Bagua, throughout his years, especially during the last decade, and in an effort to make his Wing Chun so-called more internal. And you also got another fellow. They don't get along, but I respect them both. His name is Sifu Sergio. Sifu Sergio Iadilora. Sorry, Sifu Sergio. Sometimes I get mixed up with your family name. Sifu Sergio is another very skilled practitioner who used to be a student of Master Keith Kensberg. And Sifu Sergio has also delved into the internally oriented arts. And you could check out both these people. Keith Kensberg is Keith, like you write Keith, and Kensberg is Kerspete. Kensberg. And Sifu Sergio, you can just write Sifu Sergio, you find them. Sifu Sergio on YouTube, both these guys on YouTube, and there are quite a lot of videos of them. What they do with their Wing Chun is closer and more in line with the internally oriented approach. And very close. I gather that they both are, in their own personal practice, probably they could be called internalists. And you got some other people, other lineages who do very externally oriented Wing Chun, who are stiffer, who would focus on like hitting heavy bags and look at cardio as a very important key element in their training. For instance, in the internally oriented arts, it's not that you do not have to cardiovascular fitness. You do. It's an important aspect of being fit for combat, right? Mm-hmm. Even though hopefully a street fight would not last more than 1 or 2 minutes, still it's important you have it. Sometimes you just gotta run, you know? But how do you work at it? So boxers go for their morning run. MMA people often too, or you run on a treadmill, you do the bike, you do swimming, you do stuff like that. In the internally oriented arts, usually you work at it from within your own art. So for instance, you take the Taiji long form and you do it at a very rapid pace. Or in Shen Taiji, they have the Arlu. Arlu is second road. That's the second long form. A very explosive form, very difficult cardiovascularly. And it's very difficult cardiovascular exercise in the context of movements intended for fighting. So you get both the cardiovascular exercise and the fighting aspect, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the way I prefer doing cardiovascular work. Through the practice of my art, I can take one punch, one movement, one combination. I'll just run them through for 2 minutes at full speed, or do it with a form, very rapid pace, just at the speed at which I'll be fighting. And that's really good cardiovascular work. I don't have to run if I can do that. And I believe boxers too could get into it more. I remember I read an article about Evander Holyfield, who was is heavyweight boxer. He used to be heavyweight champion of the world several times. He's the guy whose ear was bitten off by Tyson.
Right. So
Evander Holyfield, he was, like many boxers, he was into cardio. And at one point he got into stuff more like the Tabata method, like the HIIT training, HIIT training, where he would do cardio more focused on short bursts and sprints, with strength training and with just very short bursts of running, and also with mostly doing cardio with his own boxing methods and not with just running. And that's actually when he won for the first or second time his world championship. It improved his boxing significantly. So in any case, back to Wing Chun, just depends on the lineage. Some teachers would promote softness to a great degree, some would not. Some would have forms of Qigong as part of their training, some do not. So it depends on just who we're talking about. And another example is Aikido. Aikido is an art which was mostly externally oriented, in my opinion, but the founder had very high-level internally oriented skills that he had developed personally. And I say was mostly externally oriented because the generation after the founder, most of the people, again, there are exceptions like Gozo Shioda, for instance, and several of them, but most of the people who studied with Mori Ueshiba just didn't get it. They didn't, because he was a very enigmatic teacher and was into a lot of mysticism, and a lot of the skills and Gong Fu were lost. A few people got it, others did not. So you got a lot of lineages and streams and organizations in Aikido do relatively externally oriented art in the way they move their bodies. So in part of the thing with internally oriented arts is you have whole body cohesion, and the whole body must be held at one at every single moment. Whatever posture you're holding, if you're using that posture, you ought to be able to connect the entire body through that posture, which means that if someone pushes on you through that posture, through the angles and vectors intended for that martial application, you should be able to hold your ground very well and not be moved easily, and that should be done with little effort. It's supposed to be like that in Aikido, by the way. The Ueshiba and some of his great students did that incredibly well. But quite a lot of people you see in Aikido nowadays do not possess these qualities. Most of them do not. Again, there are lineages and streams in Aikido, such as yourself, by the way, what you do, the stuff that came down from Moses Powell, they do understand these things very well. So it depends on the lineage. Another thing that you sometimes see in Aikido and Wing Chun, some other times do not, is the concept of liuche. Liuche is 6 harmonies. That's the direct translation. Just talk about the 3 external harmonies here. That means that there is synchronization between. When they talk about 6 harmonies, they actually they're trying to say 6 synchronizations. Okay, that's that's what's really meant in terms of movements. So you want your foot and palm to be synchronized, foot on palm, elbow and knee, hip and shoulder. Now, it can be the right foot, right palm, right elbow, right knee, etc. So the same on both sides. Okay, and it can be the opposite. It can be your left foot synchronized with your right palm, your right shoulder synchronized with the left side of your waist, or your qua. More accurate, qua is the hip crevice. The qua is your crotch together with the hip crevice.
Okay.
That's the Chinese word for both of them together is the qua. So what does it mean that these areas have synchronization? It means that, as in the Taiji classics, everything moves together. So if your right foot moves, then your right palm, or might be your left palm, has to move too, and they have to start and to finish at the same time. Now, they don't have in the midst of it, so they start doing a movement together and they finish at the same time. In between, they might not be synchronized completely, but they have to start and finish at the same time, and they don't have to also move the same distance. So for a beginner, especially in Xing, the way you teach beginners to coordinate their 6 harmonies, these pairs of synchronizations, is you let them also always have the foot and the palm and the knee and the elbow and the shoulder and the waist arrive at the side of the waist, arrive at the exact same time, begin at the exact same time, and move at the same time. As you become more advanced, then sometimes your foot makes a small step and your hand makes a big movement. Sometimes they might not appear synchronized, but they're still in from the inside. So the more advanced you are, the more this synchronization can be internal. And you're synchronized from within, but someone looking from the outside might look as if you're just moving your hand, but inside your entire body is moving. So that's the point of it. So a lot of the mysticism surrounding internal methods, internal skills, what the Aikido people often call Aiki, because they don't use the same terminology as the people doing traditional Chinese martial arts. A lot of this is just people taking their formerly larger movements, internalizing them. Now they're just moving their waist 2 millimeters instead of 20 centimeters. What they needed to do with 20 centimeters with their waist during their first year of practice, they can do it as little as 2 or 3 millimeters after 20 years of practice. So now, because they move so little with their waist, if you look at it from the outside, if you don't have a very keen sense of keen viewing or observation. If you're not the teacher yourself, or maybe you're just wearing these clothes that cover their body so you can see the movement, then it appears as if their body doesn't move, but something still happens. It looks like magic. But they do move. Everything always moves. They just move on a smaller scale because they do not need to move as much. Is it a good or a bad thing? That's also a question. A lot of people who gain these skills begin to practice their art in a very what's called in Chinese, they call it xiaojia. Xiaojia is a small frame. Small frame meaning that they shorten and shorten their movements until it looks like they're not moving much at all. They just move a little. Sometimes it's good in terms of combat. Sometimes you need to make larger movements. But in terms of health, it's my personal observation and belief that this is not healthy because you always, throughout your life, doesn't matter what age you are, you want to keep stretching your body. If you keep making larger movements as the ones you had made as a beginner, doesn't matter if on the inside your internal skills have developed to a higher level. You have to keep stretching your body and doing these larger movements because that's just healthier for your blood flow, for your joints, for your muscles, for everything. So now back to the Aikido and the Wing Chun. We're talking about the 6 harmonies or 6 synchronizations. They often do not have these things. So you see oftentimes people in Aikido or Wing Chun, they would move their hands or their legs without moving the rest of their bodies. Okay, so then they don't have this principle of 6 harmonies. Now, it's confusing because some very high-level practitioners in these arts, it would appear as if they're not moving like this, but they're actually synchronized on the inside. But essentially, most people practicing these arts do not have the liuha principle, which is fundamental to the internally oriented arts. It is one of the keys to making the internal stuff work. If you don't nail down the liuha, the 6 synchronizations at an early stage, then all the other internally oriented stuff just wouldn't work. So once more, it depends on style, language, school organization, and specific teacher. Some have more of it, some have less of it. These two guys, Keith Kernspecht and Shifu Sergio, both excellent practitioners. Watch them on YouTube. Their internally oriented stuff is very good. And it's not about, like these two guys, they have very different outlooks. They both teach Wing Chun. They teach very different Wing Chun. I respect them both. And I know Master Keith Kernspecht, I know him personally, and I can attest to him as being just a great human being and a great teacher. And usually when people come to open very many branches and martial arts schools, they tend to be very commercialized and looking out mostly for finance, for making a profit. He's not about that at all. He's a scholar, and I wholeheartedly support what he's doing. If you have a chance to study under one of his students, then I would recommend it, just by knowing him and what kind of person he is. And just to attest to that in a way, the guy opened, because he has so many schools, he has a specialized so-called business school for which he passes all of his to-be instructors. So if you're in Keith Kernspecht organization, which is called the EWTO, the European Wing Chun Organization, EWTO, and you have reached a level in which you can teach, then you have to go to the instructor school where you study how to be a teacher, and you study the business side of it. And he also demands that each of his instructors in his organization would have at least a BA. And usually education or physical education or something related to that. And quite a lot of people with master's degrees and 3 PhDs all in his organization. And just think of it, if it's over 1,000 schools, that means he made sure that over 1,000 people get a university degree, get a university education. So that's quite a lot. Not to mention, if you just imagine if each of his schools on average had maybe just 50 people, and just calculate how many people we're talking about, right. How many people this one man had impacted in one lifetime, which is very impressive.
Well, let me ask something again about the internal and external part here. We kind of gave examples of it and talked about kind of the middle ground. is there benefit from someone that's more on the internal side learning some of the external parts? Is there benefit from someone that's more on the external part going and learning some of the internal sides?
Yeah, there are benefits for both sides. Different things. There is a very strong opinion in the world of martial arts, which is shared by many people who have gone into more internally oriented training later in life, that you got to do the external stuff before you get to the internal stuff. There is a truth to it, but it's not the truth that people tend to think of. Chiefly, it's not that you can start with the internally oriented arts. You can, and they are built to teach beginners the fundamentals from just taking someone with zero amount of knowledge and taking him all the way to the highest levels if the teacher is good and he's up to it. It's just that most people, whether in China or in the West today, they do not have the discipline required to do traditional training the way the internally oriented arts do it. So if you do an externally oriented art, usually, not always, because externally oriented arts, both in Japan, in China, and in Thailand, oftentimes they teach them, they do what the Chinese call Shifu. Shifu is eat bitter. You eat bitter, you train very, very hard traditionally. So it's not that with externally oriented art, you can't train very hard and have very high demands placed on you. It's just that in many externally oriented schools nowadays, you get more of the, stereotypical karate or taekwondo treatment. You get this group of people following the instructor, doing this. Everyone who listens, if you're a martial artist, you know what I'm talking about. It's not good or bad. It's just the stereotypical commercialized martial arts school experience. Once you've had that for a while might be a few months or a year or 2, 3 years, then going into an internally oriented art would be much easier because you've already experienced martial arts to an extent, but it wasn't too challenging compared to the demands of the internally oriented arts in terms of just the demands. I'm not talking about challenging in terms of physicality, though oftentimes it is, but you just get a better sense of what martial arts are about. You become more mature in your practice, and then you can accept that traditional mindset. But again, oftentimes you might go to this Taekwondo McDojo for 5 years, and then that would also help you to survive the rigorous training of a traditional externally oriented martial arts school, which might be just as demanding. This is just a different perspective than what people think about. But there's another element to it, which is most of the internally oriented schools nowadays do not emphasize combat. And most of the externally oriented schools do emphasize combat to a degree. Sometimes it's ridiculous and unrealistic. Sometimes this combative emphasis is very realistic to the point of people injuring themselves frequently in real combat, as is frequent in MMA nowadays, and sadly also in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Even though the Gracies intended the art to be more gentle, softer, and to not injure people in training, once Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had become commercialized in the United States and elsewhere in the world, it had come to be that because of that broad commercialization, there is a very high rate of injury in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Again, depending on organization and teacher and the people you train with, how much ego they've got, but it happens. So this is one extreme, just doing combat all the time, doing free sparring every class, and injuring one another. Another extreme is just not studying the combat or even the simplest applications of the art at all, which is very common in schools of Tai Chi Chuan, but is also pervasive in schools of Xing Yi and Pigua Zhang. Now, I have to pause here for a second. Just want to tell the listeners, there are quite a lot of externally oriented arts and quite a lot of internally oriented arts, not just the three I've mentioned. So in the internally oriented division, you've also got Liu Bafa, you've got Yilik Chuan, promoted by Sem Chin in the United States, an excellent art and an excellent teacher, also a very unique person, a very enlightened human being. There are, in my opinion, many types of enlightenment. But to the extent you can say it, I think Sem Chin, when you see him talk and the kind of kindness that just spills out of him. The kind of person he is. He appears to me from afar and from people who have told me about him and his teaching and whom I've known who have trained in his style, Electron, that he is a rather enlightened person. Xing Liu Chun and Dai Xing Chun, which are precursors for Xing Chun and several more arts in China and abroad, which are very internally oriented. And externally oriented arts, you can count quite a lot of them, whether it's Thai boxing or Western boxing or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Greco-Roman wrestling or Muay Boran or Krav Maga or Bartitsu that was back in the day, or Savat, Hapkido, Taekwondo. There are quite a lot of them. And those combination styles in between, also quite a few. You can count Baji Chun, Pigua Zhang in the lineage which I teach. The Pigua Zhang is usually an externally oriented art. Honga Kun, or Hongjia Chun in Mandarin. That might be an externally oriented art or a combination style, again, depending on teacher, organization, lineage. We have Aikido, right? We have Baihe Chuan or Bakho Kun, which is white crane fist from southern China. You got Pakho Pai or Lama Pai, which is a northern white crane or Tibetan white crane, which might be, again, externally oriented or combination style depending on teacher and lineage. It's quite diverse. I have a really extensive table in my book just specifying all of these and explaining all of the things we're discussing here at a greater depth. The book is, by the way, research of martial arts, not research on martial arts.
I apologize.
So, yeah, sure. So research of martial arts, either on Google or Amazon, would pop it up in this. So back we're discussing what? Please remind me.
What we were talking about, can an external martial artist, if they were doing...
Okay. All right. So we were talking about what the internalists have to benefit from external training. Another thing is just fitness training in general, I used to be a weightlifting coach for 2 years, and I was big into weightlifting, though I was never a bodybuilder or powerlifting, just as a hobby. I kind of let it go over the years. The type of training I do now is, mostly, believe it or not, I walk like an ape. I walk. A lot of people do. Ido Portal is promoting similar stuff. I do ape walking. I walk like an ape, either on my palm or on my 5 fingers, on the tips of my fingers, or in an open fist, or on the space, like apes walk on the space between the last and before last knuckles of the fingers, like this.
Mm-hmm.
Like what's called in it's called either leopard fist or in my Southern Mantis it's called ginger fist. So, and apes walk like that, and I walk like that too. I practice this mostly on grass or exposed earth, not on concrete or on wooden floors. It has to be a moderately soft surface, not to injure yourself. And I do any type of ape walk you can imagine. Also flip and walk like a crab. I climb trees like an ape, meaning that I don't climb the tree to get to the top. Rather, I go around the tree and its branches and just flip myself in all sorts of odd angles and do that sort of training. I also do all sorts of cartwheels and handstands and hold myself either on one hand or 2 hands, and basically all this bodyweight calisthenics. And on top of that, I have a lot of weapons I train with, and that's my so-called fitness training. Some of my weapons are quite heavy, but this is something that I've found works very well with my martial arts. Doesn't get me stiff, keeps a certain amount of muscular mass on my body. Very good for the joints, open up to the entire body, and it's just very contributes quite a lot to my martial arts. It's part of my exploration of being Ziran, being natural, moving naturally. Also, I've been walking barefoot for over 6 months, almost everywhere, unless I go to some event or a wedding or a restaurant or something like that. I walk barefoot everywhere on the streets, and I also do this training that I told you about barefoot, also on the trees. Mm-hmm. Very good for just syncing with the magnetic field of the earth. Very good, and it helps you do away with all that static electricity building up inside of you because of all the electricity surrounding us. Also good for someone with jet lag, if right off the plane or the day after when they wake up, they go to some exposed earth or grass and they stand on it barefoot for 10-20 minutes, can do training or whatever, just helps you sync with where you are at on Earth, on planet Earth, and does away with the jet lag for many people. So in any case, that's the sort of training I do, but many internalists don't do any sort of fitness training. Because of this, they might be lacking in muscular mass or some body leg connections, and you can make up for it to a large extent, not fully, with heavy weapons training. For instance, the large spear, the spears were like 3 to 5 meters long, but oftentimes it's not enough, depending on the person. I mean, some people are just bulky and large naturally until they're very old. So fitness training is not a bad thing if you know how to do it, but again, it's person specific, and there is something to learn from it from externally oriented methods. So that's not bad. Swimming is another activity. I mean, I don't use it personally, but a lot of martial artists use swimming, but you don't see it among internalists often. Swimming can be excellent in many ways, just for your general health, and can be helpful for the martial arts. And just a lot of these ideas, or you can take. I have some of the bags I use at my academy that people train with are boxing double end bags. Actually use this bag. These are excellent bags. Why not use them? And they're actually superior, in my opinion, to the heavy bag. I once saw a video of a professional boxer. He was asked, like, what's the most important training instrument you have here in the gym? And he was so surrounded by them, He has the arena, and he has this bag, the smaller bag, and the heavier bag, and the rope, and all these things. He said, the double-end bag. That's what helps me the most with my skill as a boxer. Now, with my double-end bags, it's actually a double-end bag. So a double-end bag is one ball tied from the ceiling and from the floor and bounces around in the air. And a double-end bag is just two balls rather than one. Two balls connected. So I got these two balls, and boxers use them mostly for reflex training. So what they do, they fill them up with air. So I took the insides of these bags and instead I filled them up with water. And this is just much better. I think if boxers did it, they would fall in love with this too. I've never seen people do it with double-end bags, but there is a company now selling stuff that looks like double-end bags, just teardrop shaped. These are instruments and methods and ideas that an internalist can use from externally oriented methods, and these are not bad at all. Mm-hmm. Or timing, in externally oriented arts, timing is very important. You see, again, depending on the art, striking arts, not as much in grappling arts. But again, back to boxers and Thai boxers, a lot of calling off numbers and then doing this. Or timing, like, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do this, as many repetitions as possible. Counting the rounds, like you got a 3-minute round to do something. You got to exhaust yourself through that 3-minute round or make something work throughout that 3-minute round. These things, using time, it's not something an internalist ought to use often, but these are good training methods overall, and they can be used.
Okay.
A time being that, time is an external object, an external experience. So like I said, externalists and external methods often judge themselves by comparing themselves with the clock, and against the clock. In the internally oriented arts, that's a valid method for training at times, once in a while. It's not the most important. It's not something you should do every training session, maybe not even every month or two. But you should try it sometimes. It's good.
Yeah, just to shake it up, if nothing else, right?
Yeah, sure.
One of the things in your book that I thought was really cool, because you're talking about kind of the universal theory, or the unifying theory. One of the things you talked about was the aspect of fascia when you're talking about the physiological parts. I think that's an overlooked part in a lot of martial art, well, a lot of medicine in general, but specifically in the martial arts, about what fascia is and what its role is. So would you mind explaining a little bit about that?
Yes, okay. The subject of fascia. The reason fascia come up to public scrutiny over the past 15 years or so is, maybe the past decade or so, is that a person whose name is Tom Myers had written a book called Anatomy Trains. Now, fascia, it's anatomy, not trains is in training, and not trains is a train that moves about.
Right.
People have been paying more attention to fascia for probably 30, 40 years. However, it was only when Tom Myers came with this book, Anatomy Trains, and with his research prior to that, that people started paying attention that fascia is something in the human body that begs attention. And also, eventually, martial artists also came upon this and began to explore this thing that's in their bodies. So let's first define what fascia is. If you're at home thinking about your body, you were always told that you have your bones, your tendons, you have your skin, your hair, your muscles, of course, and your internal organs. Okay, but what else? The rest of it, they told you, okay, this is connective tissues. Yes, but what these tissues, plural, what are they? So, among other things, much of that mass called connective tissues are the fascia. The fascia are as elastic plastic bands. So, if you might be tempted to think about these blue plastic wraps that you use at the supermarket or to wrap sandwiches, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the fascia actually function much like these blue plastic wraps, or they might not be blue, but plastic wraps that are used to wrap food. They're very agile. They wrap your internal organs, and they also wrap your muscles and bones, and they just wrap everything on top of wrap. So you might have one band of fascia wrapping the heart, and another wrapping the heart with another organ, another one wrapping the heart and the lungs and everything else together. So these are just very common throughout the body with multiple layers of wraps. These things are not discussed thoroughly or commonly in martial arts, and especially not in the externally oriented martial arts, because A, you can't see them. So because when something enlarges, it's mostly your muscle, okay? Maybe your bone density, you can see it after enough years, or you get fatter or skinnier, but you don't see it. Fat is another element, but you don't see the fascia because these wraps on the inside. So that's one because you can see them, they're not discussed. Now, also in Western anatomy, the reason that they have been neglected for many years is that the Western anatomists think like the martial arts externalists. So they divide things and by categories, and they try like, I work this muscle, I work that muscle. So the classical Western anatomists for hundreds of years looked at the body and they just looked at it as just a pile of things. While traditional Chinese medicine and just Eastern thought in general, they tended to think of the body as a holistic machine. So the heart was not just the heart, it's just an entire mechanism related to the heart with several other organs and things that work in unison with it. In Western anatomy, you got the heart, then you got that organ beside the heart, then you got the blood, which is flowing in the vessels. And it's not a system, it's everything on anything, they count each and every part on its own. They separate, they don't unite. It's more separatist, less holistic. So, throughout the ages, throughout the last few hundred years, the Western anatomists were looking at fascia and they're thinking, what's that goo? Because when you cut up a body and it's like you cut up these bands and you see this band breaking apart to 2 or 3 or 4 sides, and it looks like just goo breaking apart, like the goo from the Alien films,
right?
And the eggs, yeah, that actually looks like that, like the goo in the eggs of the aliens in the Alien films. They just like, oh, it's just goo. You know, what function can it possibly serve? It's not an organ, it's not a muscle, it's not a tendon. It's just this goo that's in the body. You know, it doesn't matter. Here I can just rip it apart. And they give it a name, they call it fascia, but it's not important. But then when the sciences of anatomy and kinesiology and physiology became more advanced, suddenly they realized, wait, maybe it has a function. Maybe you didn't just cut the spleen and throw it out when it has problems. Maybe you need to heal it because it has a function in the body. You know this thing with dentists, for instance, you have a problem with your teeth. Let's throw them out. Let's cut them all out. let's put fake teeth. Why? You don't need them. Here, take this fake tooth. You don't need your real tooth. What function could it? I mean, you can do without it, so we can just throw it out. That's not how they fought in the Orient. So, but in the Orient, they didn't speak of fascia either because, again, they didn't have that anatomy. They just spoke of it in a roundabout way. We'll get to that. So, eventually, people like Tom Myers began realizing, wait, fascia is not only important, but these wraps play a vital role in human movement. Because without these wraps, nothing would work together. Because if you want to connect the movements of all these muscles, it's not just the tendons. That if you take, it's not like a bridge. When you have a bridge and you have, say, the muscles are the steel beams and the tendons are the long flexible steel rods. But you don't just have that. You also have these sheets going between the beams and the rods, connecting them together in a superior manner because a human is not a bridge. A bridge cannot move a lot, right? A bridge is very limited. Why? It has mostly two major components. It has the beams, and it has the cords, the long metal rods, and it has the screws and it has other stuff, but these are two main components. But there is the muscles, the beams, and you have the tendons, the rods, and then you've got a lot of these wrapping everything from every side and possible angle, allowing that bridge to move freely as a human in all possible angles without ripping apart. If you didn't have your fascia, your shoulder would just fall out its socket. Your leg would fall out of place. Because the tendons are not enough to hold these shearing forces. So the fascia, the way you work at them, you always activate them while you do physical activity. But the internally oriented arts, they have special ways of stretching them. And it's also an interesting notion about the fascia. The muscles make us more powerful and exhibit more power usually, not always, by contracting. The fascia usually exhibit more power by stretching and expanding. So this is yin and yang, right? They work in unison with the muscles. The tendons work with the muscles exactly like they do because the tendons are directly connected to the bones and the muscles. Okay? So when the muscle contracts, the associated relevant tendons contract, but the fascia tend to expand, stretch. They sometimes also contract, but some of it is controversial because it hasn't been proven about many of the fascia that they actually can contract like muscles. So let's give a prominent example that I've discussed more thoroughly in my book, the lumbodorsal fascia. This is a piece of fascia found on our lower back. In fact, the lumbodorsal fascia is right at the spot where most people who have disc herniations or disc bulges get their bulges and herniations, around the area of the L4 and L5 vertebrae. A very important physical spot on the human body. Why? There is an acupuncture point there called the Mingmen. Mingmen is life gate in Chinese, and it connects quite a lot of the kinetic systems of the human body. So say you want to transfer power from your legs to your hands to issue a punch, right? What do? You activate your gastrocnemius muscles, for instance, and the muscles at the back of your shin. That's the gastrocnemius. You activate your quadriceps and hamstrings, wrapping your thighs from both sides. You activate your gluteus muscles, and then you're stuck. Why? Because all this power pushing from these muscles and gets against the floor and coming back from the floor through these muscles to the top of the body, it has to pass through that area, your lower back, where the thoracolumbar fascia is. Oh, sorry, I was saying the lumbodorsal fascia. Sorry, the thoracolumbar fascia. The thoracolumbar fascia is the segment that connects that lower body power with the upper body power. Because how much power can you generate with just your latissimus dorsi, which is the wide back muscles, which you do a lat spread with, and bodybuilding, your shoulder muscles and your hand muscles. they can produce a lot of power, but not nearly as much as your legs and the rest of the body. And you want to send power through the leg muscles and the buttocks to the floor. Power comes back through the legs, up the body, goes through the latissimus at the back of and the trapezius muscles at the back, going through the hands, the shoulders. All these muscles at the upper body, they generate more power, which adds to it. Then it all comes into your punch eventually. But connecting everything is the thoracolumbar fascia, which is right in the middle between the lower and the upper. Now, if you are a Western boxer, how do you solve the problem, the issue of connecting that lower and upper? You tense the muscles these muscles surrounding that area, and that tension allows for the power to transfer. That hip area, the rear of the back, the lower back, might not be as tense as required to let the power pass. You tense that area. It's like you tense it. Now the bridge is stable. Through that bridge, power passes along. You got a powerful punch. All right, that's one way. Another way is if you elongate your spine and stretch it like a pearl necklace, aligning the vertebrae of the spine nearly perfectly on top of one another, while inserting the buttocks, okay, without tensing the buttocks too much, just erecting the entire back as if it was a flat table. So when you do this, when you erect the spine and you straighten the back, you can pass a hand on someone's back and it feels like a flat table. This stretches the thoracolumbar fascia, and once it does, power can pass through the thoracolumbar fascia without too much tension in the surrounding muscles. So you get less muscular tension with the fascia being tense. The fascia tension does not interfere with muscular power production. And then because the muscles that you had to tense before are not as tense, you can tense them more and produce more power. This is the theory. In practice, it just works differently. The type of power you produce when you don't straighten your back and erect your spine is different from the power you produce when you straighten your back and erect your spine. And that's why you see in different martial arts different types of power production, because of such mechanisms, or the way you move your hip, or the way you move your waist, and these six synchronizations we talked about earlier. Basically, what makes an art is the sum of the methods it uses for training. So the internally oriented arts, what makes an internally oriented art? It's not you have, oftentimes you see in the world of Aikido, they talk about Aiki as a synonym for internal power. There's no internal power. It doesn't exist. If anyone, what you experience as internal power is a person used an X amount of methods, used 10, 20, 30 methods for training, and then the culmination of how his body has transformed because of these methods over years is experienced as a structure. So training methods create structure. The externalists and the internalists both have structures, and the structure is created through the different methods which you use. And if you have the structure of a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player, that's not the structure of a person practicing Self and Mantis, because the training methods were so different. So naturally, they end up with different structures, and their bodies feel different when you touch them and when they apply things. There is no special power. There's no external power, internal power. There is just how the structure manifests after you've trained in a certain number of ways. So the fascia, going back to it, has become the be-all, end-all of some people when they try to explain the internal arts. And this is completely incorrect. The fascia is just one component. It's just one element. In the internally oriented arts, they tell you, okay, stretch the spine as if it were a pearl necklace. This is an instruction meant to help you understand how to stretch your fascia. Okay? They tell you when you hold a certain stance, okay? They tell you to corkscrew the legs into the floor as if you're corkscrewing a jar, for instance. What people often do, and I see it often in Okinawa and karate, they use so much muscular tension. That's completely wrong. What you should do is you should corkscrew not your legs but your entire body. When you try to corkscrew your entire body through the floor, you experience it, you feel that it's the feeling comes mostly through the legs, but you feel an entire body twist. And that entire body twist is stretching the fascia and pulls it in a certain way. So this is, again, instruction for how to manipulate the fascia. And these sorts of things are often missing from externally oriented arts because these tend to be so-called internally oriented methods. However, to say that this fascia thing is the be-all end-all of internally oriented arts is very misguided. Firstly, because, like I said, it's just one element out of many. And secondly, because the word fascia is not really that important for either externally oriented or internally oriented training. It's just not. It's important if you want to educate yourself about what you're doing, why you're doing it. It helps you understand how to do your methods better. That's what my book is about, partly. But it doesn't solve the training. It doesn't take from the need to work hard. It doesn't take from the need to understand the methods as they are. Okay? Because, like I said, you can talk about coiling and twisting the fascia with corkscrewing off the legs. You can talk about it all day. But if you still think you have to tense up the leg muscles until you turn red, then you're doing it wrong. Even if you understand what it does to the fascia, you're still using too much tension in the muscles, and you don't tense the fascia right. So to use fascia as like, oh, okay, this explains everything, it's not. Neither does it explain everything about traditional Chinese medicine, because there is a correlation, and I explained it in my book, between traditional Chinese medicine and the internally oriented arts and fascia. But then again, it's just one component. Just to give a perspective, fascia are correlated, what's called cleavage points on the fascias. Just key points on these fascia structures often correlate with acupuncture points. Okay, it makes sense with the nervous system and many other things. But then again, it doesn't always correlate, and it only explains just a few certain effects of acupuncture. And then this is just a minor part of acupuncture. And acupuncture itself is just a minor part of the whole of Chinese medicine. In traditional Chinese medicine, not the modern traditional Chinese medicine of the Communist Party, but the real traditional stuff, acupuncture might not have been even 40%. I mean, there was the body work, right? Massage, tuina, there was the herbs, and these sorts of things had far broader theory and quite a lot more books and stuff written about them, and their methods were more advanced than the actual acupuncture, which in itself was advanced. So acupuncture is just a small part of TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and then the fascia is just a small part of explaining acupuncture. And that is, again, also a small part of explaining martial arts. A crucial part, you should know about it, you should understand it, it's good. It would do good for you, but it's not the be-all, end-all explanation of anything. Eventually people will get tired of fascia and you just talk about something else in 5 years.
It'll be a new trend.
Yeah, like the word Aiki, right? So maybe, I think 30, 40 years ago, no one was talking about Aiki as internal power. But what happened was some of the Aikido people got to see that they have commonalities with Chinese internally oriented arts. They got, but these people are talking about Neigong. Neigong, by the way, is not internal power, it's internal skill. Just that there's no, because the Chinese don't talk about internal power. There is no such term in Chinese. So the closest is Neigong, internal skill. So they saw this and say, so Aiki, as in Aikido, that must be referring to the internal power of the art. And this is just an entire misunderstanding of at least what the Chinese meant. And also, like I said, there is no internal power. It's just a culmination of many methods getting to become a certain structure that represents an art and a practitioner.
Yeah, the structure is definitely going to be an important part, and you put a bunch of that into your book too, about talking about the differences between the internal and external structure, and the goals of the structure too.
Yeah, well, once more, the less you have to touch your opponent, the less it matters how you can feel his body or he can feel yours. You want the internal structure to be very... But then again, you got Greco-Roman wrestling and catch-can wrestling, and you got Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, And you got that in judo and lots of stuff where you do touch the opponent, you just use different ideas and notions and methods and techniques. The internally oriented arts want to borrow power. To borrow someone's power, you gotta not be tense. You gotta be soft, but you can't be flaccid. If you're flaccid, it'd go through you. If you're too tense, then it's bad for you on the cognitive level. And it's also bad because there's always a bigger fish, a stronger fish in this scenario, and you also get tired quickly unless you're very, very, very fit. So MMA people, when you see them in the octagon, they're very fit, but they do get really, really, really tired sometimes compared to doing often not too much. In training, because of the situation, I can't blame them. That fighting in MMA is serious business, right? So they have emotional tension, so they get physical tension, and sometimes they are out of breath just doing stuff that in the gym they might be able to do for an hour. They get out of breath in a minute. So you don't want to get out of breath, and one of the ways of doing that is you have to be soft. In Chinese, they use, for soft and hard in this context, they use gangro. Gang is soft but is hard but pliable. Okay, gang hard but pliable, and ro is soft but flexible, not flaccid. And they say gangro xiangji. Gangro xiangji is hard and soft coexist together. Hard and soft coexist. And again, hard and soft, not stiff and not flaccid. Okay, so we use too much the words hard and soft in the West, but actually there are levels of hard and soft. We should say stiff, hard, soft, and flaccid. Instead, we just use hard and soft. So it's incoherent. How hard is it, or how hard is he? We just don't use a very accurate terminology, and the Chinese tend to still do it. So you want to be soft as in row, soft but flexible, being able to absorb your opponent's power. So when the power comes, you don't resist it fully, you resist it just a little to make him stiffer, which is always better for you, and then you borrow that power. What do you do with that power? That kinetic wave of energy that comes from your opponent goes into your body. If you stiffen up, you're just going to bounce. Unless you're stronger than him, then you can push him. And there's always a stronger, bigger fish. So that kinetic wave goes into your body. What do? You can take that kinetic wave and transform it into striking power, into a strike. You can take that kinetic wave it around your body, and transfer it back into your opponent to manipulate structure. His body move a certain way and balance him. That's what in judo is called kuzushi, in Japanese arts in general. Okay, kuzushi is the art of borrowing the opponent's power and putting it back to him, that kinetic wave of energy, in order to create an imbalancing effect. However, in judo, you do it in a far stiffer manner, relatively speaking. There are very soft judoka out there, not common, but they are. You try to do this without stiffening up, without grabbing much too. I mean, it's very common in judo that you grab. In internally oriented arts, you tend not to use too much grabbing, because the stiff part is usually you grab momentarily. You don't grab as you grab in Shuai Jiao, and it's Chinese wrestling, or in judo. Okay, so one way is to take that power, issue it into a strike. Another strike could be take the power from the hands and strike with the leg. Take from the hands, strike with the hands. Maybe you push it from the middle of your body and you still strike with either hands or legs, or elbow, or palm, or forearm, whatever. Yeah, it could be whatever. Either striking with that kinetic wave, unbalancing. You can use it to step. So you take that power and you make a step out of it. A step into the opponent, a step beside the opponent, a step back. You can take that power and bounce yourself back on purpose. Maybe you can bounce the opponent back, and people mock that, because there is a lot of charlatanism going on with a lot of fake Taiji teachers who like to demonstrate how they bounce their students about. It's a real phenomenon. A really high-level Taiji teacher can do it to strangers too, if the level gap is large enough. However, despite many charlatans using these games and making a ridicule out of it, and they can't really do it. They just pretend to. This is not a bad skill. Being able to bounce someone back can kill someone. I'll give you an example. If you're on the street and you're on the sidewalk, someone just picked up a fight with you. You bounce him into a bus. That's lethal. That's Dimak, right?
Right.
It's lethal strike. Yeah. You touched him and then he died. Yeah, the bus killed him. Yeah. It's lethal technique. I mean, no one thinks about it. No one's talking about it. But I mean, you. And what about that sewage hole? Wouldn't you bounce him into that? Or just if you're standing on the road, you can bounce him back and make him slip on the sidewalk. And again, he slips on the sidewalk, knocks his head against the concrete, loses his consciousness. That's a KO.
Right.
KO by concrete, right? Yeah. So why bouncing people back shouldn't be frowned upon? Like any technique, it has the right context, and you need to understand the right context, and you need to make sure that the fact that you can bounce back doesn't mean that it now becomes your favorite technique, because it's very rare. It should be very rarely used. However, within my academy, I do teach people to use that, and what I do is I whisper in their ear. I don't tell the other guy they're going to use that, and then while they do not free sparring perhaps, but they push hands freely, and the guy whom I whisper to and knows what to do, he gets the other guy with his backhand against the wall, a concrete wall. He bounces him against the wall, and he usually, oftentimes, his head gets bounced a little too, and he's completely shocked, and the practice stops for a few seconds there because it's a really good technique. It just needs the right context. All right, so earlier we talked about structure, and there are two ways to create the martial structure of an art, and each art has its own unique martial structure. If you train the art the way it's supposed to be trained, then your body is built up in a way on the inside and on the outside. So one way to gain structure is to train solo, and the other is training with a partner. There are just these two ways. You either train solo or with a partner. Each approach has its many methods and sub-approaches. Both these methods have merits. So if we are to talk externally oriented arts for a moment, you got arts like Judo and Krav Maga and BJJ and Capoeira and Shuai Jiao, etc., where most, if not nearly all of the work is done with a partner. Then you got Thai boxing and Western boxing and various Shaolin arts, Penchak Silat, and many lineages of karate in which most of the work, in terms of time spent, is actually done solo. With boxing, people often think of it as a sparring sport, but they forget all the rope jumping and the double end bag, the heavy bag, the speed bag, the road work, the strength conditioning, the shadow boxing, and all of these things which take up much of the time. So what do we learn from this? That a preference for developing structure for either partner work or solo work is not related to the external versus internal definitions. It's more style dependent. Perhaps, generally speaking, striking arts tend to have more solo work compared with grappling arts. But having more solo work doesn't necessarily demonstrate a preference. So, give a different type of example. For instance, we have Taiji Chuan. In many lineages, it's considered to be grappling focused. And the greatest emphasis still in all traditional Taiji schools is on solo forms, even though in many of these lineages that is a so-called grappling art, grappling focused art, has striking and locking and other methods as well. And you also have Eskrima, a Filipino art, or Arnis is sometimes called, or Kali, featuring a heavy striking emphasis with tons of partner work. There is also a cultural element here. In the Orient, the various cultures have philosophical and religious traditions calling for and emphasizing introspection and meditation, self-knowledge and self-awareness. It comes as no surprise, then, that in the Orient we see most arts having practice forms, called kata in Japanese or talu in Chinese. Kata has the same character as the Chinese word xing, meaning form. That's the same xing as xi. So you can call it kata-i chuan because It's the
Right.
same kata and Xing. It's the same character. And Taolu in Mandarin Chinese means a set of roads. But what is meant by Taolu, a set of roads? That you walk through a path, both spiritually and physically. You walk a road that had been walked prior by your ancestors in the art. The Chinese usually do not speak of stances. What is called a horse stance is actually mabu. Mabu in Chinese meaning horse step, not horse stance. So the talu, the movement form, or a set of roads, are these roads you walk through made of these steps, like the mabu, the horse step. The many steps make a road. Two or more roads make a set of roads, the taolu. This is why in Shen Taiji Chuan they speak of ilu and arlu. That's first road and second road. They actually connect these two forms that are in Shen Taiji Chuan. You can practice them one after the other, and they end with you facing the same place, the same direction. So oftentimes you walk a given amount of steps in one direction, executing many techniques, and then you turn around and walk back, or walk some sideways, but differently, now passing through another road. Often it is important that the different roads eventually take you to the same place where you have started. So going back to the same place, this has philosophical meaning, so it's philosophically meaningful, but also helps you gain a perspective of the level of accuracy there is in your movement, aiding you in finding out whether you have been slacking with some of these steps. Because if you have slacked with one or two steps, then you're not going to end up in the same place. When you can walk, so to speak, a road perfectly, then you embody the essence laid out for you by an ancestor in your art. When this essence is embodied, you can almost hear that ancestor talking to you. Not really, right? But almost. For the movements. His wisdom can be shared throughout the generations, even if you have never met him, because you can, in a delicate yet accurate manner, recreate his spirit and actions with your own mind and body. In the internally oriented arts, this can go a long way. I have expanded upon such notions greatly in my book. So going back to structure, what is the best way? Is it solo work or partner work? In my opinion, there is no best way. Both are equally valid, but each has its important qualities which the other one lacks. So if I'm doing partner work, I have someone trying to do something to me, it's very difficult to focus on my own body. How am I going to pay attention to the dantian, which we'll talk about in a moment, or my breathing, or what I feel, or where I am in space when the other guy is trying to punch me or just move me around? So this is difficult. However, if you only do solo work or mostly do solo work, then it's difficult to know and feel what it's like to act against a living human being, which is, of course, after all, the purpose of martial arts. You have to interact with other human beings. And that sort of interaction, is very important also in terms of the social interaction of it, the social aspect of it. So people talk about push hands in the internally oriented arts or chi sao in Wing Chun. They talk about the martial utility and the martial methods contained within and how it can flow into martial techniques. But what about the social purpose of it? Did you ever consider that it's basically two people massaging each other? It is. It is. And how often do you get another person massaging you? I mean, if it's not free sparring, in free sparring, you're trying to hurt each other to a degree. Okay. But most of the time, you can do free sparring all the time in any art, doesn't matter. Free sparring makes for a small portion of your training. It might be small or a tiny portion of your training, might not even exist, but it's not a large portion of your training because when you do free sparring, that you exhaust your body in a way that doesn't, you cannot just do it all the time. So most of the time, it's friendly work. And during this friendly work, especially in the confines of Tui Shou, that's push hands or roll show, or just rolling hands, or Chi Sao, that's sticky hands, what you do is you have a session of mutual massage. It's actually you're massaging your muscles and your bones and your ligaments and your meridians, and this is very healthy for you. just human contact and just interacting with a human being in a very physical way. We're, after all, apes. We're just naked apes, you know? And you watch these apes, these gorillas, these nicer looking gorillas. They're not fighting over the females in the forest. What do they do all day? They forage and they groom each other. They massage each other. They pick the fleas out and eat them because apparently it's supposed to be tasty. I don't know. I haven't tried. Maybe that would too become part of martial arts. I don't know. And so that's mutual grooming. That's something that we have in our genetic makeup as humans, but we tend to forget. When you are a father, then you have children whom you do this with. If you're a good parent, you're a father or a mother, or if you're a child. But then again, if you're not in a parenting position or you're not the child, what's in between? You have sex with your partners, all right, but how long would that last? And do you do it every day? And do you do it for an hour, for 2 hours? And maybe you go to this Aikido session or this Taiji session or this Shingi or whatever, and suddenly you get to do mutual massage with someone for 2 hours. That's really good for your overall health, your mental health also. It's good for your blood flow. And this is also an important aspect of it. And this is something you don't get from your solo training. And going to the solo training, especially with internally oriented methods, you can change your body from within in ways that another person cannot externally apply to you. Even if that person is a specialized doctor, whether in Western medicine or Oriental medicine, doesn't matter. There are certain things that only you can do to yourself. Essentially, even with medicine, only you can fight your own depression. Only you can fight your own demons. And these are things that come about and that you do through solo work, some of the things you do. So both solo work and partner work have their merits. Personally, I spend more time doing solo work. Maybe 70% of my time, of my training time overall, is solo and 30% with partners. And I think that strikes a good balance, again, in the confines of internally oriented methods.
Okay.
So, any questions on that?
No. We were starting to get into the structure, talking about how to build up the structure. So, and that'll kind of lead into the other part of it too.
Yeah. Okay. So we have Dantian now. All right. So talking about the Dantian, if you don't have any methods designed for training the Dantian, or even the language for it, then how are you going to address it? How are you going to practice using it? First comes the language, then comes the meaning. You understand what the language means. Then, when the meaning is understood in a deep way, you can do away with the language. That's straight from Zhuangzi. So this reflects the progress in all types of Kung Fu, not just the martial arts. Going back to the Dantian itself, what is it exactly? Before I tell you, maybe you tell me. Let's hear your definition. What do you think the Dantian is?
Well, in Japanese, we have a term called hara, which is translates like center. So that's kind of the way I'm using it, and it could be, again, language kind of goes back and forth and doesn't quite work all the time. So that's kind of the way I'm interpreting it.
All right. So in Japanese, you also have tanden. Tanden is technically the Japanese term for Dantian. Okay. Do you use that one?
I've heard it enough. In our particular dojo, we don't use that one as much, but yeah, I do know the term.
Yeah, all right. So if we talk about hara is belly. It's the same as in the term harakiri.
Right.
That's slitting open the belly when you perform seppuku. Seppuku is, for those who don't know, it's ritual suicide in feudal Japan when someone has failed their duty, is either a samurai or a politician or whatever, sometimes because of personal or clan shame, or just a general sense of overburdening shame because you failed to do something. You might commit this traditional suicide seppuku, also known as splitting the belly, harakiri. So, but when we talk about hara, this speaks of the entire belly. And if you've got a big beer belly, that's a lot of belly we're talking about. But sometimes when we talk about the dantian, we talk about an area being a bit more specific. So the Chinese refer to an area that's roughly 3 horizontally held fingers below the navel. So if you put just 3 fingers held horizontally just below your navel, the place just below the last finger would be the dantian, but not right where your finger touches, actually in the middle at the core of your mass. And this is the general area, and we're also talking about roughly about a big square around that area, a big circle around it. So when I speak of the dantian, I'm speaking of a type of engine that's also a wheel. So the main engine in our bodies are the legs. This is agreed upon by all martial arts, I think. And then you've got another big engine, which is the spine, which not all martial arts utilize to the fullest extent, but these are the main 2 engines. And then you've got the dantian. The dantian is a smaller area, and even though it's muscular, it's not that large. But the dantian functions differently than these engines. The dantian is just at the center of gravity and the center of mass, and what it does is it's both a wheel, meaning that it controls and directs movement throughout from the whole body, from your hands going to your feet and from your feet going to your hands. But on top of being a wheel, it's also an engine. So imagine this wheel that also has an engine within it to amplify the power coming from the other engines. So you always generate power from the legs and the spine, and this power is often coming from the ground. But then when you want to control that power, to transfer it efficiently and accurately, then you do it for the dantian. And when you want to add a little bit of power to it, if your dantian is developed, that is possible also. Now, the dantian is always at work, not just in the internally oriented arts. Everyone who's moving, even just walking in daily life, is using their dantian. The difference is how well and what is the level of finesse with which you can utilize that area. Most people cannot move it. In the internally oriented art, you aim to be able to move it quite a bit. Move it in circles, move it in spirals, etc. What are these circles and spirals? Essentially, because the dantian is the wheel moving it all, the circles and the spirals that the dantian is trying to mimic are those of the rest of the body. So the dantian, you might draw a figure 8 with your qua. Qua is the groin region together with it's the hip crevice with your hip joint. So you're gonna draw a figure 8 pattern with that area, and then the dantian would complete that figure 8 with circles of its own. These circles help connect the power generated by this figure 8 to the rest of the body and take advantage of as much of that power as possible. But for that, you need special training methods. So the dantian is said to be able to rotate. It can rotate vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. And in my experience and in many internally oriented arts and traditions, it can also vibrate. So this is a less well-known and common method, but you see it in many internally oriented art lineages and traditions. It is different from the actual rotation. The rotation of the dantian can be felt in the following manner. If someone puts one palm on your lower back, maybe on the Mingman point, which we have discussed earlier, or below the Mingman, just on your lower back, and the other on your navel or below your navel on the dantian itself, then they can feel, if you're proficient, that you're using your dantian like a rotating ball, as if it was a ball floating in the pool, and you're moving it about and it was rotating within the water. It has a heavier feeling because it carries the center of mass for the body, but this is the closest analogy of how it would feel. So imagine this inflated ball floating in water, only that ball might weigh maybe 20 pounds. It's just a heavier ball. And then this is rotation. And he can also feel, if he puts one hand at the front of your body on the dantian area, and then he can touch with his other hand, he would touch either your thigh or your knee or your palm or your forearm or your elbow, then he would feel that these areas are drawing circles and issuing out energy and kinetic waves in line with what the dantian is doing. This is a very kinesthetic experience that's difficult to explain just by talking about it orally, but once you feel it, you know what I mean. The vibrating of the dantian has to do with minute spinal and leg movement, enabling the actual contents within the dantian to vibrate. This causes the dantian to feel as if something's vibrating. And the closest analogy I've found for these mechanisms working in unison, which I've used in my book, is that of a powerball. So if you've ever held and played with a powerball, you just know how it feels, so you know what I mean. If you haven't, a powerball is a plastic ball encasing another plastic ball. So it's one plastic sphere wrapping another, and the plastic sphere that's within rotates very quickly. And it rotates randomly because it's a gyroscope. And because it rotates randomly, the powerball, which is the size of roughly of a closed palm, it vibrates in your palm, but also draws circles. So it's moving in random circular directions, but also vibrates at the same time. And because of it, it's very difficult to control. The powerball is very small, right? The powerball is maybe 3, 4, 5 inches in diameter, but a grown person can have difficulty controlling it, even that if that person is 230 pounds. Because when the powerball accelerates and it moves about randomly within your palm, then your body has a difficult time to adjust to both the speed and the vibration and the rotation at the same time. So it's like a tiny animal going crazy within your palm. It's like your cat when you're trying to hold your cat, and cats can go crazy and they don't want to be held. And it's really difficult to hold them, even though they're these small animals. First, because they're very strong. All felines are. And secondly, because they move in this random manner with all these spirals and circles, and they're just uncontrollable. Unless you wrap them in a towel, or you're willing to take all these bites and scratches, which few people do, then it's very difficult to control a panicked cat. It's roughly the same, just with more control and less panic and chaos. So this is what the internalist is trying to do, essentially, in all internally oriented lineages and traditions, in my opinion. That's a part of being at the highest level. I'm not saying this is the highest level, but I'm saying a part of being a high-level practitioner is being able to do that. Is that not just your dantian, but your entire body can move like a sphere, like a powerball. You both draw a circle, and again, you can draw a vertical circle, and a horizontal circle, a diagonal circle, or a combination of these circles. So you can start drawing a vertical circle and then make a diagonal, just changing between the circles all the time. At the same time, you have some form of vibration going on, and also on top of that, you can do spiraling, because just with any martial movement, I mean, just talk about just a regular back fist in karate, the hand forms a spiral, right? When you issue the punch. So you want to have that spiral. You just want to have it not just with the punch. You want to have the spiral, the actual spiral, like with the hand, going on through the entire body with all parts connected at the same time, making the same spiral or several opposite spirals while making a circle or a combination of circles. And while doing all of that, you also vibrate to an extent. All of that together makes you into so-called human powerball. It makes you into something that's very difficult to control. Now, notice that I use the word control. It doesn't mean that someone can sucker punch you. They can. But if they touch you, if you are very proficient, then relative to your body weight, your strength, your skill, you're much more difficult to control. And often with the best internalists, you can't touch them because you place your hand on them and there's either nothing there because they can empty their structure, and that's another trait and another type of skill, or they can make it so that you can't place your hands on them because you feel that you can't transfer any weight onto them. You cannot, or you can't keep your structure intact when you touch them. You just lose grip immediately. You can't grab onto them. You can't manipulate them. You are being manipulated, but you can't feel how. So this is what the internalist seeks to do, and much of it comes down to dantian training and being able to use the dantian. And there are specific methods for training the dantian. And dantian also develops naturally with internally oriented methods just by means of exercising things like the liuche, the six synchronizations, which you have discussed. Just moving your qua first in circles, then in figure eight patterns, then in not just in figure eight, but more like a Mobius strip, which is a so-called big secret in the internally oriented arts. Both the figure eight and the Mobius figure eight, which is more defined and more sophisticated, these are things that most people do not talk about, do not write about, and then you can't access if you're not talking to someone who knows about it and is training it. And while doing so, your entire body has to be connected. But basically, essentially, if you don't have the liuche and you don't have some development of the dantian, you can't do all of these things. So these two things, the liuche and being able to move and rotate the dantian, not necessarily vibrate it, that's a higher level skill, but rotate it, these are paramount for attaining internal gong fu, and these have to be developed, and you need to nail their basics throughout the first 3 years of training to just have anything to be so-called internal.
Well, I think that does a pretty good job of explaining it, what it is and all that. Sorry. You want to move on to the Pigua and their weapons then?
Just a moment. So another thing I want to mention.
Sure.
Another internally oriented method, so to speak, is slow training. Now, a lot of people utilize slow training in the externally oriented arts as well, but what counts as slow? This is a difficult subject. I mean, so in my book, I called the chapter discussing this slow as a snail, because this is what I mean by slow. As slow as a snail moves. It's very, very, very slow. So in internal theory, what you're saying is, throughout each movement, you have moving from point A to point B. Now, if we think of filming, in filming you have frames, right? Mm-hmm. You have how many frames per second. So if I go from point A to point B when punching someone in real life, that someone's threatening me or my family or my friends, it's gonna be very quick. There are only gonna be 1 or 2 frames in that movement, from my fist somewhere next to my body to my fist in his face, 1 to 2 frames at most. But if I want to really understand that movement, if I want to be able to keep my structure intact throughout that movement and feel everything that's happening within my body, I want to feel my dantian, I want to feel whether I am making the liuche happen, I want to feel whether my breathing is correct, I want to feel my blood flow. I actually have to pay attention to whether my feet and my palms are cold, meaning that I don't have the necessary blood flow in that sort of training. I want to feel all of these things in all the yi training. To be able to do that, I have to have many more frames from point A to point B. So if executing that punch takes me a quarter of a second, that's maybe 1 or 2 frames. If executing that punch takes me 2 minutes, that's the extreme, right? 2 minutes just to execute one punch, then maybe I have 200, 300 frames within that punch. I can learn quite a lot by doing this. And in the internally oriented arts, when they were taught traditionally, at least the way I was taught and the way I teach my Xing, during the first 2 years of training, it is crucial that a large portion of the training, sometimes up to 80 to 90%, is done very, very, very slowly, which can get boring at times when you are a beginner and a lot of people are not up to it. However, once you start getting good at it, it actually becomes quite interesting, because with every passing second, you begin to notice things you've never noticed before. And then you get the opposite feeling. Sometimes you execute that punch within 5 seconds. And then you feel like, but that wasn't enough. There weren't enough frames here. I couldn't really pay attention to this. My foot was misaligned. How could I miss that? I missed it because it took 5 seconds to do. maybe if I do it for 20 seconds, this time I can pay attention to my feet. And then I do it for 20 seconds, then I manage to pay attention to my foot, and then I realized that I really wasn't thinking about my dantian. I wasn't breathing right to the. You ought to breathe to the dantian area. This is crucial to all Oriental meditative traditions, the internally oriented arts included. So maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to my actual breathing. Why? Because it was just 20 seconds. Maybe if that punch takes me a whole minute, then I can do the feet and the dantian and the breathing and everything. And then you do it for a minute long. And then you realize, oh, but my shoulder alignment. And it never ends because you can go and endlessly perfect your movement. Of course, this can become obsessive. You shouldn't overdo it. But the way you are taught traditionally in the internally oriented arts, this is very important for a beginner because this sort of training helps people learn to pay attention to many things at once. And this is another part of internally oriented fighting theory. The theory being, in that case, that if you are able to pay attention to many things at once, if you are able to do two things at once, and the other person can only do one thing, then you have superiority. If the other person can only do two things at once, and you can do three things at once, then you have superiority, etc., etc. So if we're talking about, you see this often in the Chinese traditional martial arts in general, but more so in the internally oriented arts, the use of three limbs at once. So you'd use two hands and one foot at the same time, each hand and one foot drawing each of them a different circle in a different direction. Sometimes you draw a square with one hand and the circle with the other, and the foot would go forward. So it's each one of them does something very different. And when someone comes in contact with that, their structure becomes very confused. Their body does not react well to that because you need a superior level of coordination. So oftentimes my students complain that the coordination is so difficult. They have to coordinate so many things at once and it just boggles their minds and makes training very difficult. And they have to slow down more and more and more to be able to do all these things at once. And I tell them, all right, so you tell me you're confused? That's great. You should be confused because once you're not confused anymore, then your opponent is going to be confused. Now you know, now that you are getting so confused about this sort of coordination work, now you know how your opponent will feel if you can perfect it. He will feel the same confusion, it's just that he's not trained to deal with it, so now he has a problem. So another thing with slow training, I've written about this in my book, I'll keep it short, is about the Weber-Fechner law. The Weber-Fechner law is about how much you can pay attention to weight changes and bodily changes under stress. So, for instance, if we take 2 teaspoons and we give you 1 teaspoon to hold in each hand, and then we put just a few grams, a few ounces of something in these teaspoons, and 1 spoon, let's say these teaspoons have the same amount of stuff. Say it's sugar. So we put 2 ounces of sugar or 2 grams of sugar in each teaspoon, and then we put a few more in just one of them. You would be able to feel the difference. Even though it's a very small amount of weight, you still be able to feel the difference. Now, what if I give you 2 10-pound weights, and I put 2 10-pound weights in your hands, and now on top of one of these weights, I'm going to add 2 ounces of sugar. I'm just going to put that 2 ounces of sugar over just one of these weights. Chances are you might barely be able to notice something. Most people would not notice anything at all because the weight difference is too large. And this is the same. If you were to carry 2 people, then you wouldn't notice anything. If one of them drops a water bottle he was holding, you wouldn't be able to measure the difference at all or to even feel it, because the more you're under stress of, say, weight, actual physical weight being weighed upon you, the less you can feel minute differences in pressure. And the less weight the less pressure that is applied on you, the more sensitive you are. So taking this and applying this to the martial arts, we can deduce something very interesting. We can say that essentially the softer you are, you can detect changes better, right? Because if you are softer and you are accepting a physical force coming against you with a greater level of softness, if you are less tense, then there is less pressure, there's less weight, less physical pressure applied against you, right? So you can notice minute differences in a better way, just as you could you could notice a difference of just 2 ounces of sugar, right, between the spoons. However, if you are very tense, it is akin to just lifting a heavy weight, and then you cannot notice all these minute changes. So apart from actual combat, when you're by yourself, when you're doing this solo work, when you do slow training, there is less of a pressure, there is less tension upon you. Because when you move rapidly, just by the sheer force of gravity and by your muscles having to tense up more, then naturally there is more pressure placed against you by the planet and from within your body. So the less you can notice all these minute controls and the things you need to change and alter and being controlled of within your body, within your structure. But the softer you are and the slower you are, the more control and the more balance and the more finesse you can have in your movement. So this Weber-Fechner law, which was not at all concerned with martial arts when people thought about it and demonstrated it in studies, is actually very important to understanding why slow training is crucial to the internally oriented arts.
Okay. That's a pretty good description of it, too.
All right. So the Pigua weapons, right?
Right. Yeah, we usually like to ask about, in particular, it seems Chinese martial arts happen to have a lot of specific weapons that they use. So what about Pigua? Do they have any specific or unusual weapons that they train with?
Some usual, some more common among the Chinese arts.
Okay.
Essentially, we're talking about the 12 hands of Pigua, the empty-handed methods, and the 40 to 42 different variations in my lineage. And once you've covered that, and you can do them quite well, then the transition to weapons is rather easy, because the weapons utilize the empty-handed steps and mechanics and methods of the art almost one-on-one. I mean, the transfer is very smooth, and I tend to tell my students that nearly all of the methods contained within the 12 hands can be found within the weapons, and the weapons themselves actually give you quite a lot of ideas of how you can further use the 12 hands and the 42 variations and elaborate on them and free your body even more. And Pigua is an art which is about freedom of movement, and in many ways often freedom from structure. It's key to learn structure in Pigua to be able to hold your body well, as you would like to do in the internally oriented arts. However, it's not originally an internally oriented art, and even in my lineage with the internally oriented influence, it's still a combination style, and it emphasizes to a much greater degree the ability to move freely in space and be unpredictable, much in the way that you want to use your body in Western boxing, simply with very different body mechanics. So in Pigua, we have the following 4 weapons, which I teach by this order. We have the Biangun, this whip staff. We have the Miao Dao, which looks like somewhat like an odachi, or a very long katana. We have the Feng Mo Gun, which is another staff which is eyebrow high, and we have the Dao, the nearly the standardized Chinese curved sword. These 4 weapons, unlike the 12 hands and their variations, are not taught through solo, standalone solo drills. We do have standalone solo drills from them, but the core of the practice is actually 4 very long forms. Now, you'd see that I teach the gun, also called the Zhaofangbian, the wind chasing whip. So the Biangun is taught first, then it comes the Miao Dao, then the Fengmo Gun, and then the Dao. I find it interesting that these weapons are apparently roughly the heights of 4 of the human chakras. So that they just happen to be, and it's not by coincidence. I'll explain it in a moment. So, not with regard to the chakra system, but the heights are important. So the Dao we use is a two-handed Dao, not a Da Dao though. It's a regular design Dao with a straight handle, and its length is roughly just above your belly button. So, and then you have the Gun, the Biangun, which is the height of your middle dantian, the danzhong. It's the height of the solar plexus. So roughly like an Aikido Jo.
Mm-hmm.
But an Aikido Jo might be 100. Sometimes it's standardized to 127 centimeters, which for some people that's the height of their solar plexus. For others, it's slightly lower or higher. Then we have the Miao Dao, which is roughly the length of the base of your throat. And then the Fengmo Gun, that's the height of your upper dantian, between the eyebrows. It's also called Qimei Gun. Qimei Gun is eyebrow height staff. So these are also standardized heights for Chinese weapons in general. So the Dao is the height of the third chakra. That's between the lower dantian and the danzhong, the middle dantian. Then the Biangun is the height of the fourth chakra at the danzhong, the middle dantian, the solar plexus. Miao Dao, the fifth chakra at the height of the base of the throat, and the Fengmo Gun, the Qimei Gun, the height of your upper dantian between the eyebrows. Why these heights? Well, because firstly, there is enough of a height and length difference between them, right? And secondly, so you wouldn't use two weapons which are too close in length, which can become confusing. In Japanese arts too, from what I know, the jo is made to be longer than katanas to avoid confusion and also to create an advantage of the stick being longer than the bladed weapon.
Right.
So, and another aspect of it is that you're able to basically pick up and fight with whatever, because whatever length of a thing you pick up in daily life, you have a weapon that corresponds with that length. The forms are very characteristics of Pigua, the weapon forms. They use the whipping mechanics of the art, the Biangun, Zhaofangbian form, wind chasing whip, is more akin, more similar to Tongbei whip, Tongbei stick. All of these forms use a lot of movement in space. So these are forms which might be difficult at times to practice at a small space, even though in Chinese martial arts, Chinese traditions, they often say your art needs to be structured in a manner that would enable you to practice on the area of land that an ox lays down on. So if you can take each and every movement of the art and practice it just within the confines of the limits of an ox laying down, then there's something wrong with your art. And there's a truth to that. So if you take and isolate single movements from the forms, yes, they abide by this law. But if you want to practice the whole form, which is important in the context of Pigua, to develop a very specific and unique flow, then you need to have a lot of space, especially with two of these forms, the Dao form and the Miao Dao. Actually, 3 of them: the Dao, the Miao Dao, and the Fengmo Gun. Another thing which is characteristic of these forms is that they are very apparent. They're very notably battlefield forms. So a lot of traditions in the Orient, people would segment them by being either civil traditions or battlefield traditions. And often they talk of Xingyi as being an art which came from the battlefields, because a lot of it is based on spear mechanics. However, I do not succumb to that logic, because when you look at the spear of Xingyi trend, even though many of the techniques are battlefield techniques, you don't see any battlefield formations in the art. And the martial artist practicing Xingyi trend does not fight as if he's on a battlefield. You don't have countless opponents surrounding you. You don't have the type of footwork that's characteristic of a battlefield. Maybe to some extent with the spear, but not at all with the empty-handed methods. And this is just a misunderstanding in Xingyi history. But if anyone wants to learn more about the history of Xingyi and in general and that of Yichun, its offshoot, then you can Google the history of Xingyi Chun and Yichun, and my name, Jonathan Bluestein, and you'd find an article I've written on that. There's also a very long and extensive lineage chart about this on Wikipedia, on the Xingyi Trend page on Wikipedia, which I checked freely, and that lineage chart has over 250 teachers. Wow. So if you're a practitioner of the art, you'd probably find either yourself or your teacher or your grand teacher on that chart. So in any case, going back to these weapons, they're battlefield weapons, and they have battlefield thinking. So one of the things you see a lot in the forms is keeping the enemies back. You're making certain movements, not with the goal of maybe making contact with the opponent, which they could, and it would be devastating, but more so to deter people and to push them back. Sometimes you see movements intended to just, in my interpretation, push against shields, or push another weapon away from you with your empty hand. And there are very abrupt changes in direction. There sometimes with the longest of the weapons, the Hommogun, the eyebrow height staff, you would flail it in the air to create a perimeter. So if people are surrounding you, and you can attach the staff to yourself, but wave it around above your head for a moment or two as a whip, then you're creating a perimeter. And this is a classic battlefield technique, and I'm quite certain that I've seen it quite a few times in Japanese Koryu arts as well. Mm-hmm. So from a person looking from the side, this would just look crazy. And indeed, the form is called Hommogun. That's a crazy demon staff. Yeah, crazy demon stick, yeah. But it's because you're looking like a madman, flailing it and just running. And speaking of which, speaking of running, these forms have a very strong cardiovascular element to them. They take anywhere between 1.5 minutes to 4 minutes to finish at full speed. And when I speak of full speed, I mean you're running. You're sprinting throughout the entire form. And the reason you can actually sprint for 4 minutes is A, you're recycling your momentum from movement to movement. So this helps you conserve energy and not waste it, and that way you can keep sprinting. And that's really sprinting speed. The other manner in which you can still do it for maybe 4 minutes is that you change movements all the time. If you're actually sprinting, as in running, you're repeating the same movement, and that's very tiring. But in these forms, you may repeat the same movement up to maybe 3 times, but you change the movements all the time. So some of your muscles get a rest while others are working out. Even though your whole body keeps working, but you change all the time. That's how you can just keep sprinting. And this is also important in fighting as well, so that you can just keep changing, not get stuck. And these forms are essential in teaching you that, and they teach you the most important characteristic and aspect and skill in the entire Pigua system, which is conserving the momentum and rolling like a pearl in a jar. So if you put a pearl in a jar and you move the jar about in circles, then the pearl just keeps rolling and rolling and just via its own momentum, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what you need to do with Pigua. And this is a very different type of momentum conservation than what you'd see in most of the work in the internally oriented arts, and also very different to what I do in my Xingyi trend and my Jekyll Self and Mantis. And I believe Pigua is a splendid art. It's very fun to practice. Has a fun element about it. When your body is very open, it's just running and jumping around, and everything is opening and closing. It's like dance. A lot of people who see either me or my students practice Pigua, they sometimes mistake it to be a dance because it looks very cheerful. And this is also, people sometimes criticize these Chinese traditions who stress bigger and more open movements, even though usually you the big and open movements are intended to be practiced as such and then applied, whether with a partner or in real fighting, as smaller movements. And that's the way I teach it too. Even though most of these movements can't be applied as is, and Pigua in general, like the Southern Mantis I practice, is distinguished by that every single movement is meant for combat. However, these big movements, if you just think outside the context of actual combat, they have other benefits to them. They stretch your body. They help more with cardiovascular training. They are fun, and fun is important because when you have fun, you train more. They basically free the spirit. You feel free while you practice this art, and oftentimes in the internally oriented arts, they can be so tight. They're not tense, but the structure might be very tight, even if you're very relaxed. And that sort of tightness might not be good for all people in the long term. Some people need to open up. Some people need to just break free and run around and dance, and it's very free. And you can do martial arts, and you can just go dancing in your free time or do some similar activity and just run about, do, I don't know, ultimate frisbee or something like that. That would give you similar not spiritual, but similar emotional benefits. But still, just having this art in my arsenal, it has helped me tremendously both in understanding fighting and the general mechanics and the mindset of traditional Chinese martial arts, but also on the emotional level to balance out what I do with the internally oriented arts. And this has again to do with no art is superior. And you can learn quite a lot from any art you practice under a good teacher. And I feel that Pigua Zhang had been vital to my understanding of martial arts in general, and my martial arts and my teachings and my explanations of the arts would have been very different if I just skipped from Xing Chuan to Southern Mantis and did not had that experience in between.
Okay, well, I think that's a pretty good description of that too. Anything else you want to add in here, or?
No, that's all I could think of. I think that's it. That we've got quite a lot on record.
Oh yeah, I think we're almost 3 hours here. I think we're a little bit over 3 hours. So, I might end up actually breaking it into 3 parts. I have to see how I can edit it. Where if there's nice break points, so to speak. So, let me figure that out, and once I get the episodes up, I'll make sure I let you know.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay. And if you need anything about it, if you want, I don't know, if you write a second book and you want to talk about that, let me know. Anytime you want to talk about something, we can do this. This is fun.
Thank you so much. I actually have a second edition coming maybe in 2 or 3 months.
Oh,
but
okay.
I didn't want to talk about. Yeah, I didn't want to talk about it in the interview because I figured that if I talk about the second edition now, then people would avoid buying the book for the next 2 months.
Right. Well, when it comes out, let me know, and at the very least, I'll make sure that everyone knows there is a second edition once it comes out.
Yeah, it's gonna be. There's gonna be an edition of roughly 50 pages.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, that sounds good. Yeah, let me know when that comes out, and at the very least, I'll make sure to mention it in the show, put it on the website, that type of thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Hey, man, have a happy New Year.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
To kind of wrap things up a little bit here. In your book, one of the things I really liked about it was the huge amount of citations, honestly. I mean, I could tell you really did a lot of work on this one. Do you have any favorite books that you would recommend? Just because we were talking a little bit at the beginning about how, most martial arts books are just kind of books of techniques, or they'll give you little bits and pieces. Do you have any favorites that you recommend to your students?
Well, we have a large library, so it's very every student would get different recommendation. But here's what I can say. for those looking to understand Chinese culture and traditional Chinese martial arts, very important to understand mostly Taoism and Confucianism. Buddhism is also important, but to a lesser extent in the martial arts, in my opinion, most martial arts. Way more important to understand the Chinese mind in general, to know about Taoism and Confucianism. For this, there are 3 books you need to read. First, which is likely one of the most important books that anyone can read in their lifetime, is the Tao Te Ching, or often transcribed as Tao Te Ching. But no, it's pronounced Tao Te Ching. And Tao Te Ching is a very short book. You can read it in likely 3 to 4 hours at most. Very important work. It's called the Bible of Taoism, even though it's not a Bible, and Taoism it's not originally a religion.
Right.
Okay, so it's important to know that Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, all 3 were not created as religions. As over the centuries, people have created religions out of them, but their origin texts are not religions, and they don't preach any religious practice. And you can read the Tao Te Ching and the rest of the books I'm going to name. Even if you are a very religious Christian or Jew or Muslim, it doesn't matter. These are not religious books. The second book is the second most important book in Taoism. It's called the Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi was a historical figure, and he wrote that book, and it has no title, so they just called it the Zhuangzi after him. The third is the Analects, the Confucian Analects. The Analects is a collection of 499 sayings or stories or tales about Confucius, collected, written down by his students. And you need to read this, but you also need to read commentary. For all these 3 books, the Tao Te Ching, Zhuangzi, and the Analects, you read them, but then make sure you read commentaries, because if you have not been brought up in a Chinese cultural environment, to understand these books, you need people to explain them to you. You might understand some of it, granted, maybe a lot of it, but to really understand it deeply, commentaries are a must. Also, I very much recommend that you read, at least for the Tao Te Ching, read more than 1 translation. Again, it's a very short book, takes just 3 to 4 hours to read. Read 2 or 3 translations. Very important, because people understand this book very differently. It's thousands of years old, so the language is very anachronistic. And once you read 2 or 3 translations, you get a sense of what the book is really about. And you can also choose whichever interpretation that means more to you. And it's not a religious book, so there is no dogma here. This is in terms of Chinese culture. Now, for martial artists, if you practice the internally oriented arts, especially Tai Chi Chuan, you need to get a book that came out recently called the Tai Chi Classics. The Tai Chi Classic, this edition by Zhang Yun, Zhang Z-H-A-N-G, Yun is Y-U-N. It's a monster of a book. It's over 800 pages long, I think.
Wow.
It's a translation of all of the Tai Chi classical texts, all of them into English. It took, I think, over 13 years to write. It's a very Master Zhang Yun. He teaches in the States, in Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, and he worked at it with 3 of his veteran students, and it's a very impressive piece of work. Zhang Yun is a disciple of late Master Wang Peishang, who is a very famous teacher of the Chinese internal martial arts. The second book for people pursuing the Chinese arts is The Power of Internal Martial Arts and Qi. The Power of Internal Martial Arts and Qi by Bruce Francis. A very good book. Bruce Francis is a somewhat controversial figure in the world in U.S. martial arts politics sometimes. I respect him and his life work. And this is a most excellent book that he has written. And this is perhaps the book that influenced me the most when I went and wrote my own work. And some other books I can recommend. Mm-hmm. Books by Shifu Nilripsky, who's a friend of mine. He'd written a book about the Chinese traditional arts. Shifu Nilripsky, private name is Nil, family name Ripski. That's Ripski. You can look up his name on Google, on YouTube. He's got a lot of interesting instructional videos and videos about Chinese arts and Chinese culture. Really cool dude. Just a wonderful person. I love him. He's teaching in Canada. He has live-in students, and he also does seminars abroad. Books by Shifu Nigel Sutton. Nigel Sutton, also a great human being, has been in the interior-oriented arts for decades, mostly doing Tai Chi, I think. An Englishman. I envy his lingual abilities as an Israeli, for whom English is not my native tongue. Nigel is just such a wonderful author. Such a pleasure reading someone with such wonderful English. It's just and for people practicing Tai Chi or just the Chinese classical arts, just wonderful piece of work. And Nigel, often in his books, he tells you about his traditional training under various teachers, and he has a really nice window for the readers for how it is to practice with a traditional teacher who's doing it the traditional way in Chinese martial arts. Another book is Neijia Trin, Internal Family Fist. It's written Neijiaquan by Jess O'Brien. Jess O'Brien, who's, by the way, a student of Bruce Francis, in the book I recommended earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And Neijia Trin is a book in which there are many interviews with distinguished martial arts teachers. Highly recommended, very interesting book. It has inspired the many interviews included in my book and part of my work. And finally, there is a fantastic book called, and a very funny book called Steal My Art, Steal as in theft, of all things.
Okay.
Steal My Art. I cannot recall the author, his exact name, but it's a book about the martial arts teacher, late martial arts Tai Chi teacher, T.T. Liang. It's T.T. Liang.
Okay, and we'll have all those links on the show notes.
So, and another special recommendation, if you're Germans, if some Germans are listening to this,
okay,
then get the books by Keith Gansbach. He's written quite a few wonderful books in German. And also, if you're German, you're lucky because a friend and colleague of mine, Professor Hermann Baum, had come up with a translation of Chen Xin's book on Chen style Tai Chi Chuan. Chen Xin isChen, Xin is Xin. I'm not sure how the book is called in German, but Chen Xin's book on Chen style Tai Chi Chuan by Hermann Baum. His name is spelled, it's HermannBohn.
Okay. Last little bit here is we've talked about your book a bunch. Where do people get your book, and how would they? Because they all should. I mean, if they like the discussion that we're having here, they obviously should get the rest of it.
Well, my book is really available on all Amazon affiliated websites. That could be Amazon.com, Amazon.ca for Canada, Amazon.co.uk for Great Britain, Amazon.de for Germany, Amazon.fr for France, or Amazon.it for Italy, etc., etc. All these websites sell my book, Research of Martial Arts. Mostly, if you are lucky enough to live in one of these countries I mentioned, that you likely be eligible for free shipping for the book. And if you want some more information about the book, you can get it on researchofmartialarts.com. And on researchofmartialarts.com, there are 72 pages containing sample chapters from the book. It's quite a lot, 72 pages. And a lot more information. You can read reviews there. And also, if you on Amazon.com, there are currently 104 reviews of the book, most of them very positive, so you can read what people thought of my work and see for yourselves. And oftentimes it's people with their real names, and some of these reviews are from respected martial arts blogs. So these are martial artists, people who know what they're talking about, and you can read that, and you just listen to this interview, and you can decide for yourselves.
Okay, well, let me say, Shifu Jonathan Bluestein, thank you for coming on Martial Thoughts podcast and talking to us for here.
Yeah, sure. I just had a wonderful time, and thank you for the opportunity to share this information. And I hope that in the future, a lot more martial artists would come on your podcast and other podcasts and would share from their personal knowledge and observations, because I feel that in modern times, many a time people only share with their students and within the confines of their school. And there are so many excellent, wonderful, skilled, knowledgeable teachers out there who should be writing books, who should be interviewing on podcasts and putting videos out there and telling of themselves and their arts and what they know, and they don't do this. So I'm calling out to all of you guys. We can make a change in the world of martial arts. We can help people who are just starting out, or even those who've been in the arts for many years, to acquire more knowledge, things that they couldn't get from their own teachers. And I know I've written my book because a lot of the information in it I couldn't get from my teacher, because neither I nor them have a monopoly over truth, and we're all still learning. We're all students. Master Keith Cannon told me just this year, just a while back, that he's an eternal student. He is always looking for people to teach him. Guy's 71. He's been practicing since maybe age 5. And you look at a person who, like Danny DeSanto, a friend and colleague of Bruce Lee. The guy is also, I think, in his 70s, done maybe 13 or more martial arts. These people are an inspiration, and more of these people should be putting out what they know. And if they do, the world of martial arts could become a place with more knowledge and less politics. And I hope that in that sense, my book would be a positive reading experience and beneficial for both those who are complete beginners in the world of martial arts, and also to those who've been in the arts for many years and are looking for a different perspective, unique outlook, and just a collection of things that otherwise you'd have to read a few dozen, maybe a few hundred books and articles, and would have to get it from elsewhere. And maybe they couldn't connect the points, but I could help them connect some of the points. And maybe now that they've read my work, they could write better books. And these are the types of books that I want to read. And I really wish that a lot of people would write books way better than mine, and that would help the martial arts community tremendously.